All right, thanks so much for having me in today. I always like to start by giving a little bit of background about who I am, where I'm from. One of my mentors, or my mentor, Dr. Jackie Ottman, who's Vice Provost at the U of S now, has a practice that she does with her students and with different activities where she asks, who am I, where do I come from, where am I going, and what are my responsibilities? And that's something that I've taken up from her, and I think it's a really great way of meeting and getting to know one another before we do our work. And I do that with my students in my class, and not with my class of 250, it doesn't work that way, but with my class of 35 we do it. And it's interesting because I give the students as long as they want to explain those things about themselves. And sometimes it takes the first 2 full classes for us to just introduce ourselves. And our students are getting really uncomfortable and antsy of like, when are we gonna start doing the work? And I explain to them like, this is the work right here. Like us sitting down and talking to each other and getting to know one another before we start working. That's part of the indigenizing process of education. So to me, this is really important. I'll share who I am, and then we'll give a chance for a couple people who are brave to stand up and share who they are, where they come from, where they're going, and what their responsibilities are. So I'd like to start out with this photo on the bottom left-hand side. So you can see it's what we now call British Columbia. It's where my people are from originally. If you look right in the middle there, you'll see this yellow bit right here. So that's like around the Prince George area over to like close to Smithers and sort of down to around the Cornell area as well. So that's where my tribe comes from. So externally we're called the carrier, is the way they refer to us, but we call ourselves the Deketh. The Deketh means people who travel by water. But we're called the carrier because when the first settler populations came through, when they met people in our community, we have 2 sayings. When somebody passes away, one of them is we sit on the grave for a year. It's that year of mourning that you have to go through when someone passes away. And then the other one is that we carry around the bones of our ancestors for a year. Those are 2 like figurative sayings for mourning, but the settler populations that came through thought that was a literal thing, that we actually carried the bones of our ancestors around for a year. So they called us the carrier. So that's why we're called the carrier from the outside. I actually heard I found at the University of Victoria within the archives that some researcher from I think it was in the 70s or 60s, sorry, interviewed my great-great-grandfather. And my great-great-grandfather was telling a story about how when they met the first settlers that came through. But the thing is that in Deketh, when you tell stories, you tell it in the first person, even if it wasn't you that it happened to. So I think it was like a couple of generations before that it actually happened. And he was telling the story about like the first settlers came and they saw them and they were like these guys with furry faces walking around, is what they were saying, because like people in my community don't have any facial hair. And they said they were gonna hunt them because they had no idea who they were, and they were tracking them for a couple of days. And then they like saw those guys using the washroom and they went and looked at it and they're like, oh, it's just like ours, let's go talk to them. So they went and made friends with them and they stayed with them for the whole winter. So that's the territory that I come from. A lot of the Deketh people move between those different communities. And if you know, just like south of there, around the Williams Lake area, the Chilcotin people are from there. So the people in the carriers typically marry Chilcotins. So there's a lot of intermarriage that goes on between those 2 communities. 4 of my nieces and nephews are half Chilcotin and half Deketh. It's a really interesting relationship between those 2 communities. There's some cultural things that are similar, but there's quite a bit of difference actually. BC, more than most other parts of the Americas in general, has greater cultural diversity than any other part. And the reason why they think that is because like when the ice-free corridor opened up, these are the first spaces that people came to when they came over to the Americas, and they sort of fanned out from there. So in Canada, I think there's 14 Indigenous language families, and 8 of them are in British Columbia. So there's a huge amount of diversity between like pretty small areas there. So despite being quite close to each other, there's some significant cultural differences between the Chilcotin and the Deketh. And you can see those cultural differences on display if you go to a wedding anytime. There's usually a lot of animosity between those 2 communities and the way things are done at those weddings. So I've been to a lot of them where a lot of tension breaks out, but those are the 2 communities that are typically marrying one another. So if you go up above that, you'll see Nadleh Whut'en First Nation. That's the actual reserve where I'm from. We lived there until I was about 5, and then I was sort of back and forth living there in the summers and living off the reserve during the rest of the year. So I'm from 2 different First Nations. Nadleh Whut'en is one of them, and then Buhn is the other. Nadleh Whut'en is like just outside of Fraser Lake, and then if you go west of there a little bit to Burns Lake and you go across the lake on the south side, you'll come to Buhn. And there's 4 nations on the other side of the lake, and a bunch of them had to move together because at one point there was a huge flooding that happened because of there was a hydro plant that was built there. And I read this paper recently, and I was unaware of this, that the biggest band over there on the other side of the lake is called Chislata First Nation. It's a pretty big nation. And I read this paper that said their actual territory up until was another like 100 kilometers away, like sort of deeper away from the city. But what happened was they were going to build the hydro plant, and so the government went and talked to all the settler farmers and were saying, we're going to give you, I think it was like $1,500 per, I can't remember what piece of land they were going to give them, and had this big negotiation and paid for them to move their houses as well. And then it was 10 days before the actual flooding. They forgot they hadn't talked to the First Nations yet. So they went to the First Nations and said, we'll give you $75 per like the same area of land, and we won't help you, we won't pay for you to move. So they had to move like in 10 days notice from their nation, and they had like a really strong farming culture set up in their community and sort of had to leave all that behind. In addition, the government told them, well, they said, we can't go because our graves are really important to us. We have these responsibilities every year with the grave sites. And they said, that's going to be fine. It's not going to get flooded. Well, it did. And that is like irreparably damaged in that area. I don't know what happened to that one. We still got this one. All right. So then that's the nation that I'm from. Then if you go over to the middle, you can see the photo of there's the three people in the front in the regalia, and then the woman in the back. So the woman in the back is my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Agnes. People called her Alu, which means mother and carrier in Dacath. So the community I come from is matriarchal and matrilineal, which means that we get the women are our leaders, and you get your status through your women as well. So she was like the head of our clan system. So within my community, we have the Palach system, which is our governance system. It's extremely complex. It's like the government system, the justice system, and the education system sort of all rolled into one. And it's very, very complex. Like I've been to dozens of Palachs, read books about it, talked to people about it, and I only have, I would say, like a surface level understanding of it. It's a very, very complex system. So she would be one of the ones who was the head of our Palach system, head of the Frog clan for sure, and sort of a leader within all the clans at the same time. So when she had 7 kids, and she was married when the smallpox epidemic hit. And when it hit, 6 of her kids and her husband passed away. The only ones that survived was her and my great-grandmother, who's over in the bottom right. Her name was Werklund Louie. So they were around, like, they were from Clayton, which is near Prince George, and then had to go move into Fort George when that happened. And then from there, they moved over to Saikaz, which is a couple 100 kilometers over to the west. And then she met my step-great-grandfather, I guess it would be, who's on the, no, he's not in that photo. So, you know, the leadership of women is like a huge, significant thing in my community, and most of the clans are led by women. So if you look in the bottom middle there, you'll see a symbol of the beaver. That's the clan that I sit with. That's a clan that I belong to in my community. So being a beaver comes with a great deal of responsibilities to other people in your clan when a significant thing happens. Like to give an example, right now there's been a death of a significant beaver in my community, so I have to go back and fly back there tonight and have responsibilities in terms of supporting the family, supporting the potlatch when it's happening, different responsibilities that come along with that. So being a beaver is like a big part of my identity in my community, and it's interesting because, as I said before, it's matrilineal, so you get your status through women in your family. And my dad's 100% Dacath, and my mom's a white lady. And in order for us to get sat down in the clan system, my mom had to get sat down first. So if you were at the potlatch tomorrow with us, you'll see like a blonde white lady sitting with the beavers. That's my mom. And that's the only way we were allowed to get sat down, was if she gets sat down first. So that's just a big part of like carrier identity and Dacath identity, is being aligned with the clan system. And it was interesting, like in the late 1800s, the government made the potlatch system illegal. They outlawed it in 1881, I think it was, until 1952. And they said, if you read the reports from the Indian agents, they were going to these potlatches, and they were seeing, like if you ask people tell me what an aspect of the potlatch, typically they say like people give away gifts. And that is part of it, but it's a very, very small part of it. And it's a very oversimplification of that system. So it'd be like the equivalent of if I came to your graduation ceremony and saw people like putting on black robes and getting handed out pieces of paper, I would say, well, this education system is ridiculous. All they do is put on costumes and get given a piece of paper, not knowing the 12 years that went behind that and all the complexity that's involved. And the government outlawed it for a couple of reasons. One, they thought that they wanted Indigenous folks to be ingrained within the Western economy, so they could have some semblance of control over them. And if they have their own economic system, that sort of deters them from getting involved in the Western economy at the same time. So if they outlawed that, then it was like really hurting that economic system. In addition, they thought that system was creating a lack of appreciation for goods, because they thought people were just giving stuff away. They said, well, people are just frivolous with their things. We need to teach them to be good capitalists and like value the things they have and think about them differently. But from my perspective, more so, it was like the cultural and community approach to a colonial agenda. If we think of like residential schools as the way to address it with children, then like banning these potlatch systems are the way of doing it with people who are older. In this territory, similar things happened around here where they outlawed the Sundance at the same time. So similar like systems that would have been used for people to, you know, it's the equivalent if I came into Medicine Hat and outlawed the education system and outlawed the government, the justice system, and outlawed, closed down City Hall. If you think of what would happen to this community after that happened, it would be pretty short order that you'd have chaos, and that was sort of what was expected. So if you go to the top right-hand side, you'll see some photos. I do not have any kids. I don't have 6 kids, but those are my nieces and nephews. And when I think of you know, who am I and where do I come from? I shared that a little bit. And what are my responsibilities? I think of like the education system that my nieces and nephews are going through, and think of the ways in which it's different and progressed substantially from the education system that I experienced. So growing up in central BC in towns that were half Indigenous, half non-Indigenous, you'd expect some representation in that education system of Indigenous ways of knowing, and that just did not exist in the school at all. There was almost no teachers, a few EAs maybe in the education system, very little curriculum, maybe some like references in the fur trade, and that's about it. Nothing at all, not even close in the area of like pedagogy or assessment, or like just like the way in which we interact with one another. So that absence of representation within the school system, I think both like physically represented there, but then also ideologically represented there, really sends a message to those Indigenous students in those areas of like the way in which they're valued, the way in which they feel about themselves and their communities. So to me, like I think of my responsibilities going forward is how am I helping to support an education system that's more responsive to the needs of Indigenous students when they're going to school. So a little bit about me and my background. Where am I going? In addition, in a million different directions right now. I've researched in all across northern Canada. So I do work within northern Saskatchewan, which we'll talk about a little bit later, with a bunch of schools and school districts there and an on-reserve school. I do work in northern Alberta doing research with about 6 communities and a couple of different school districts as well, northern BC as well, and do a lot of work around Calgary with a number of the school districts on stuff like we're doing today, but then more specific, targeted, decolonial and indigenizing approaches to education. So that's a little bit about who I am. Do we have anybody who wants to share who they are, where they come from, where they're going, and what their responsibilities are? It'd be great to hear from 1 or 2 of you as well.
That's fine, I'll go. I'm actually from, I don't want to stand up. I'm actually from Manitoba.
Okay.
I'm part of the Red River Métis. So my grandmother came from Fort Alexander, Scanterbury, which is up kind of by Pine Falls area, if anyone's familiar with Manitoba. So that's kind of that side, and then my mom's side of the family is Icelandic. So European settlers that had came over kind of in the late 1800s to that area. So I moved here about 2 years ago, I think. And I think that kind of the topic that we're going to be talking about has always interested me because of my background. But similar to your story is like where I grew up in Selkirk, it was very like half Indigenous. Like we had like 3 to 4 reserves that were surrounding our town, and lots of people had moved to like that central city, but you didn't see that representation in the schools, or there was very small representation. So kind of interesting where my interest is right now in education.
Mm-hmm.
Because part of me sometimes feels guilty that that's not a bigger part of who I am, even though I know it's like my past and like my family is. So I think I just want to learn more about it, which is why I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you. One more person want to share with us who they are, where they come from, where they're going, their responsibilities?
I am probably the closest to going somewhere. It's I've got about a year and a half and I'll likely retire.
Oh, okay.
Both my parents were born Italian. My great-grandfather was in the same house, was Austrian. Then, you know, the territories kind of changed, and now it's Italy.
Yeah.
After World War II, it became Yugoslavia, and then Yugoslavia separated, and now it's Slovenia. And so the house hasn't moved, but the country's kind of moved. And they both came here. There's just no work after World War II. They tried to get work, and they applied for a work visa in Italy because they escaped the border to get, because Yugoslavia became communist. They escaped the border, got to Italy, applied for a work visa because they couldn't get work, and applied to come to Canada. And they thought whichever one comes first is the one they're going to take. And they got accepted to come to Canada. About a week later, they got the work visa to work in Italy. And my mom said no. We said whichever one comes first, and so they came here and had a choice of moving to Churchill, Manitoba, or a lovely sounding town called Coaldale, which sounded so nice in their language. Coaldale sounds a lot nicer than Churchill, you know, when you're come from there. And so they moved to Coaldale, which they later found out was Coaldale. But when they read it, it looked like Coaldale in their language. And lived in a chicken coop. Basically, it was a dirt floor. It's now a chicken coop, but you know, it's just a shack, dirt floor, for a year, and then just worked their way to Lethbridge, and then to Medicine Hat. And then I was born in Medicine Hat. My older brother was born in Lethbridge, and my other brother and I were born in Medicine Hat, and just kind of stayed and made my living here. And I could see the light at the end of the tunnel where I'll, you know, do a lot of travel, I think, and that kind of thing.
Have you had a chance to go back to the former Yugoslavia?
Yeah, actually, I've been back several times. A funny story. I went on a cruise once, and we bought jewelry. My ex was with me. I bought some jewelry for her. And there you pay with your room key is how you pay. You don't pay in cash. So I went to go pay, and this girl said, "Grizanich, you're from my town." I'm like, "Oh yeah, really? Like, which town are you from?" And she says, "Gijon, which is the town my dad is from." I was like, "Yeah." She's all Grizaniches are from Gijon. I didn't know that, you know. And I says, "Are you from Gijon then?" Well, she goes, "Actually, no, my boyfriend's from Gijon. He's a Grizanich, Marco Grizanich, which I'm related to. I don't know him. But, you know, I know, I found out I'm related to him. But she goes, "I'm from a town called Corte, which is where my mom is from." I was like, that's just crazy, you know? So, anyway.
My wife is from Serbia originally. She was born there and moved to the States when she was 3. So we go back there every couple of years. And it's really great experience. But her grandma comes from a really small farming town, and we go stay out there, and it's really, really lovely. But then everywhere you go, people are like really excited to see her, and then they like want you to come over, and it's like 10 a.m. and they'll bring out like that rakia. I don't know if you've read rakia before, but it's like 90% alcohol, and it's like 8 in the morning, and they're just like keep on giving you rakia, and it's like can't handle very much of that, that's for sure. But it's a really fascinating experience of like the people I know being from Serbia and then going to Croatia and stuff like that and hearing those like different perspectives. But it's actually, I'm surprised when I go back how uniformly most people have a positive view of Tito.
Oh yeah.
Even like people from Croatia, which is really surprising to me.
No, he was my parents thought he was a wonderful man.
Yeah.
They left because of work, basically.
Yeah.
They all think that he kept everybody
Yeah.
kind of together. When he died, they knew there was going to be trouble afterwards, and that's when the war.
Yeah, well, my in-laws they moved when my partner was 3, they moved to the States, and then the war, like the Americans were bombing Serbia when she was like 8 or 9 years old, so it was like a really complicated experience for them there. So thanks so much for sharing that, it's really great. I just think it's so important that we like take some time to get to know one another before it can be challenging work, and if it's on an impersonal level, I think it doesn't work very well. It makes me think of like I lived in Uganda for a year, and when I worked with people in Uganda, you'd have to like get to know them really well before you started getting to your work. So you'd get to the meeting and you'd like talk for like 3 or 4 hours, and you wouldn't even really get into the work, and they're like, that was great, I can't wait to meet with you again. And you're like, wait, I thought we were meeting about this school project we were working on. But like that thing of like getting to know you is foundational in order to do the work, and I think that's such a great lesson to learn. So the way I envision this work of, you know, Indigenous education, Indigenous knowledges, decolonizing, Indigenizing, for me, I see it as like a cooperative or a collaborative process. I don't approach this through coming in here and telling you like, here's all the things that are wrong, a lot of finger pointing at people. The way in which I see this work as being supportive, being collaborative. And if you leave here feeling bad about yourself, then I've done something wrong, I think. And you know, I've seen some approaches where it's more like aggressive, and that's not my way of doing it at all. My way is thinking, my assumption is we're all on the same page here. You know, we all have the same outcomes that we're after. We realize we want the best for all of our students, and we know that maybe the education system hasn't offered the best for Indigenous students historically, and we want to try to address that. So my feeling is, you know, we're all on the same page here. It's just how do we get there? And, you know, the way I see this work and the way it's sort of changed over the last 10, 15 years is that if I was here 10 or 15 years ago, I think most of my time would be convincing you that this was necessary and important. But instead, I feel like most of us have gotten to that point already, and now we're just figuring out how we do it rather than the importance of doing it in the first place. And when I talk to students and I talk to groups of teachers about that, I say like, I'm basing my assumption that this is where you are. But the other thing I would say is, even if you aren't there, well, this is your job. So you don't have a choice of not being there anymore. So like with the TQS and the LQS and the SLQS, like it is no longer an option. This is not optional work. It's a requirement of our jobs, is that this is the work that we're going to take up. So going forward, you know, we will talk about some tough subjects. I try to keep it as light as I can and don't get into like the real nitty gritty. But the intention of talking those is like understanding a way forward rather than dwelling in those pasts and just thinking about, you know, those terrible things that have happened. So my approach is always like intends to be supportive and intends to be collaborative, does not intend to be shaming. I just think that's not an effective way of teaching in the first place. You're not going to shame somebody into doing something. That's not a very good way of doing it. Instead, it's here's the necessity of doing it. Here's some approaches that we can think, and here's some practical ways where we can begin making that happen. My focus is really on the practical. I think one of the roles that I have as an academic is translating these things that exist in theory and translating them into practice is sort of where I see a lot of my work. I think I see my responsibility as creating that theory as well, but the translation of it is as important. A lot of times when I go to schools, they'll bring in like elders or knowledge keepers into those schools, and they'll have these amazing presentations and talks about like Indigenous knowledges in these different areas. But then there's no understanding of how do we then take that knowledge and then begin applying it within our own classrooms or within our own school. And that's where the gap is, I think. And that's a lot to ask of the schools of like, let's take this really complex philosophy and then somehow translate that into your practice right away. And that's the thing that's missing a lot of the time. Like even in the work that I do in unreserved schools, I see similar things happening where, you know, I was at an unreserved school in northern Saskatchewan, and they had these 3 days before school, which were amazing, where they like took us into a sweat. And then we went to the sweat and they took us to the knowledge keeper and they talked to us for like a whole day about the different principles of like being on this land and different things. But then there was no, after those 3 days, these amazing 3 days of learning we did, there was no intentionality of, all right, what did we learn? And then how are we going to begin using that in this school? Instead, the expectation is like somehow this is just going to be infused into who we are, and we're going to know how to begin applying that. And I think that's the real disservice that we do to educators a lot of the time, is we leave that gap open and we expect them to be able to sort of traverse that gap somehow. But I think it needs to be very intentional from my perspective, and that's sort of some of the work that I see myself doing. And if you have any questions along the way, ask away, don't wait till later on. So before we get into some of the other topics, I want you to take a minute with the people at your table. If you're at your own table, maybe jump on another one. And just think of like what you would like to get out of the session today. Thinking of where do you feel like you have room to grow in this area? What sort of gaps in the knowledge that you have right now? Think about your teachers and students. How can we collaboratively develop knowledge to support them? Thinking about translating knowledge into action as well, but then also think about the areas where you feel confident in. Where do you feel like you've had some success already? Because we aren't starting from the ground here, and I think it's important to think of those successes that we've had and how can we continue to build on them. So let's take like 2 or 3 minutes with the people around you. talk about what you're hoping to get from today, then I can hear from you and sort of tailor things in that direction a little bit.
I think the gaps in our own knowledge or my own knowledge around what I believe to be the truth or accurate. And so feeling like if we were to translate knowledge into action, I think that's some of the hesitation when dating the TQS to see that. It's just everybody goes to that, well, I don't know. How will I know?
Yeah.
And so I think it's just to attend things like this and be able to have accurate knowledge that turn into action as well.
Excellent. Wonderful. Anyone else?
We talked about a couple things, like talking about getting, because right now in our department we're doing Circle of Courage with a lot of our kids.
Yeah.
And I just started reading Reclaiming Youth at Risk yesterday. And there's lots of good kind of identifiers and things in there that aren't necessarily like things that you have to teach about it, but it's your way of going into teaching. It's that philosophy instead of it being just like a story or like the history of it, but it's actually like a practice that you put into it as opposed to something else. And then say like how kids have really responded to that because it's a visual that they can see. But saying like we are having trouble like making kind of those visuals, and I think that's that gap, right?
Okay, excellent.
But yeah, and then I don't know. I said it was like, well, I still feel like I feel pretty confident like sharing who I am and where I come from. And so I've done that with my kids a lot, where I will just talk. And like if I know they're having a rough day, like I could go have a story about anything, right? And it kind of like then it goes sometimes into deeper things. So I think that's also important.
Yeah, it's like I think it's a real strength if we think about creating that space where students feel comfortable sharing who they are and sharing those things about themselves. I think that's like one of the things we're trying to achieve. One of the, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but for me, one of the goals that I think in my classroom that I'm trying to achieve is that creating those areas of ethical space. And there's a couple of scholars who talk about that. There's Willie Ermine writes about it. Dwayne Donald writes about ethical relationality. But I view it a little bit differently. The way I view ethical space is how are we creating spaces in our classroom where people can come from like different cultures, different ways of being, be who they are, and be heard and be valued. Like to me, that's what ethical spaces really are. How are we creating those spaces where students feel comfortable being who they are in that space, and then we're creating a space where they can be heard and be valued in that as well. Like we may not know the way every single culture represents something, or we may not know every single cultural practice or way of being, but how are we creating a space where it's all right for those students to be that and to teach us that at the same time as well? So to me, like that's a huge strength of just like modeling is one of the biggest things. When I talk to my pre-service teachers that I work with, at the university, I tell them like the two of the biggest things I think that they can do is one, modeling a value for Indigenous people and knowledges. Like them modeling that to their students is a huge thing. And then the second is like trying to challenge their own expectations or have high expectations for Indigenous learners as well. Those are two of the biggest things I think you can do for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners in this area. Some of the teachers, some of the districts I go to and some of the schools where they say, well, we don't have many Indigenous students here. And I say, great, you've got a huge role to play in this, because how are we challenging it for all Canadians, their view on indigeneity? How are we modeling for them these ways of being have actual value within the school system and within education? Those things are huge as well. Excellent. So I think like some of the things you talked about with areas you want to grow and areas where you feel like you have solid foundation are things we're going to have a chance to build on today. So one of the things I like to start with is these common refrains of apprehension that we hear. So I teach in the Faculty of Education at the Werklund School of Education, and we have a mandatory Indigenous course that started about 7 years ago. My mentor is the one who started it, and at the beginning when that course first became mandatory, we had a bunch of students who went to the dean and were like, we refuse to take this class, it has no relevance for us, and really fought it. And it's like, I can't identify with that for two reasons. One, like I don't understand how you can think that. And two, it's impossible for me to identify with students who feel so sure of themselves that they're going to go tell the dean what they're going to do and not going to do. But like building from that, like things have changed a little bit quite a bit over the last 7 years, and students are coming to our class totally differently than they were before. More background knowledge, interested in this work, but we hear these common things at the beginning of every single term. So I lead that course now, so I led the design of it. We have 17 sections and I oversee all of them, teaching a couple of them, but support the teachers in the other sections. These are the things we hear every single year, nonstop. First one, I'm worried I will say or do the wrong thing. So people, when they think about taking on Indigenous education, when they think about doing this work, this is the first thing we hear over and over and over again. I'm so worried I'm going to say the wrong thing. And you are going to say the wrong thing, so that's a fine worry to have. I promise you, you're going to say the wrong thing. I say the wrong thing all the time. But holding ourselves to this impossible standards should not be the reason why we avoid doing this work. And I can give you some examples of saying and doing the wrong thing. So I've told you that I'm from north central British Columbia. I do a lot of work with a lot of Cree communities in northern Canada. And I know some about Cree culture, but I'm far from knowing everything about it. And I've made repeated mistakes working with Cree communities. And my feeling is if you create a strong enough foundation of a relationship, people are going to be far more understanding when you do make those mistakes. So very recently I made one of these where I'm on a project where we have 3 aspects of the project. It's we're on the 4th year right now. First part is that I'm working on is we're trying to learn their foundational principles of the Cree ways of knowing and embed those into the pedagogy of the school. That's the work that I'm doing. Second part is they're trying to challenge success in numeracy and literacy. And the third one is a colleague of mine is doing work on mental health, supporting teachers to support mental health of students in the school. And in that work I was doing, one of the things we were trying to do early on was get the teachers to do check-in. So just basically looking in the kids' eyes when they come in of how are you doing today, to get a sense of how things are going. And I was telling the teachers a bunch of times, hey, you got to do check-in for these reasons, and we're going to build on it with these other things. And then the first 2 weeks went by and nobody did check-in. And I was like, you got to do this. And I was getting really frustrated, we got to do check-in. And then someone pulled me aside and they were like, in Cree culture, it's inappropriate to look someone in the eye and ask them how they're doing. So it was I said the wrong thing and was pressuring them to do the wrong thing. So I had a strong enough relationship with them where it was fine, and I was self-deprecating, and I was you got to tell me right away when I'm overstepping, because I don't know that. So these things are going to happen, but this cannot be the reason why we don't do this work. The feeling we're so worried about saying and doing the wrong thing. And we're going to get into it later, but I think it's this binary conceptualization of oppression that leads us to being so worried about that. And the way we see oppression, racism, sexism is a binary. Either we're a terrible racist or we're a good person. And we fall on one side of those. And to realize that we have accidentally or unintentionally colluded with these ideas that may be oversimplification of another culture, have racist aspects to it, with that binary, we sort of have to throw ourselves into that one side of it. Nobody wants to view themselves as being within that area, or most of us, I guess, would not want to view ourselves in that perspective. So that's, I think, why we're so apprehensive to get involved in this work. So we're going to have a conversation about some basic terms that can help us get past that, but then hopefully getting to the place where we're comfortable, where, yeah, we probably are at some point going to say the wrong thing, but that's all right. So for some reason, this just goes 1, 1, 2. It goes in binary code. I don't know why. I can pretend that I did it on purpose and there's some hidden message that you got to catch on to, but that's not it. Second, I don't know enough about this subject. So the second area that people who get apprehensive to get involved is because I just don't know enough. This is such a huge issue, such a huge topic that I don't know enough about it, so I don't feel comfortable talking about it. So with our students who take our undergrad course, what I tell them at the end of our class, we only get 8 weeks together, but it's a pretty intense 8 weeks. At the end, I say, well, if by the end of this you still feel like you don't know enough, then who's going to teach this? Because you're going to be going into schools and you might know more than anybody else in that school about this topic. So if not you, then who's going to begin taking on this work? And the feeling that I have about this as well is, sometimes I feel I don't know enough about this subject. I have a PhD in this area. I'm viewed as an expert in a lot of places, but it's such a vast area of knowledge that we can never know it all. But how can we enter it in a way where enter with humility towards the knowledge? So if I go to, we have this program where we take students out to Whut'en, and I'm Decath, not Blackfoot, and that's a really important Blackfoot site. So like, who am I to take them on the land and be like, look at all these like beautiful Blackfoot things and try to explain to them? Like, I know a fair amount about Blackfoot ways of knowing, worked with a lot of elders, done a lot of reading, done a lot of work in that area, but I am like, I do not feel like I should be in the position to do that. So when I approach that work, what I tell them is like, you know, I know a little bit about this, but we should learn about this together and try to pursue this knowledge together. How can we together learn more about this specific Blackfoot way of being? How can we learn from the land? How can we learn from their knowledge keepers? So it's understanding that we don't have to know everything and that we don't have to represent ourselves knowing everything as well. We had a really interesting experience where it's Randy Bottle who goes out there with us and he teaches all our students on the land. And we went out there 2 years ago and my colleague, Dr. Aubrey Hansen, who's a Métis scholar, and I were on our way driving out there and we got a call. We had like 40 students with us. And we got a call and it was like, Elder Randy was like, I'm sick, I can't make it. So Aubrey and I were like, well, we're canceling, right? Like you and I are not taking these kids on, all these students on the land and teaching them. And we figured out that we couldn't cancel. So we had to take these students out on the land and teach them from these Blackfoot sites. And we had to like really think like, we do not know enough about this subject here. So we had to like learn as much as we could. And our approach was like, how can we learn from the land together? How can we understand that, you know, we have so much to learn about these areas, and how can I go in from a perspective of humility as well? So to me, that's really important. And in so many other areas of education, like we might not know everything about the subject, but we still feel comfortable going in that area and teaching. And this is the one area, and I think that's out of respect of like not wanting to do the wrong thing. But I think this is something we also need to think of, like not allowing these things to be barriers to us getting involved in this work. The third is, am I the right person to take on this work? So the question is, like, shouldn't it be an Indigenous person teaching this sort of knowledge? And my response is, of course you're the right person to do this work. If we silo this work only for Indigenous peoples, then it's sending that message of that modeling to those students that this knowledge is not important to you, or you can't be the one who takes it up. It's only for these Indigenous folks. And to me, that's a really problematic message to send. In addition, like if we're in a school and say we have like one person who does this work within our school, then we're putting all that pressure on one individual in the school to teach that. And for a lot of schools, that person might be external to that school as well. So we're bringing in some elder from the community. So that person is responsible for all the Indigenous knowledges within your school, or all the decolonizing and Indigenizing work that happens in your school. You wouldn't do that for any other topic where you're like, we're gonna bring this external person in once every couple of months and they're gonna educate you on all this. So I think everybody's the right person to do this work. It's just understanding your positionality within that. And that's not to say you have to like go lead your class on taking them on a sweat and do like these really traditional things, but how can like you approach this knowledge in a really meaningful way? So we've got another one here. While I agree that it's important and I have a role to play, I do not know where to start and how to take up this work. So for this person, they've gotten past that first one of being worried about saying the wrong thing, starting to feel more comfortable. The second one, they realize they're never going to know it all, but they're trying to learn as much as they can and understanding, coming to it with humility. They see they're the right person, but then they don't know, how am I actually going to do this? Like now that I see myself as someone who should do this work, I don't know where to start. And we're going to get to some of that stuff today. Last one, well, inviting an elder in suffice. It's not enough. It's great. Invite elders in, they're amazing. But we need to think of how we're going just beyond that and how we're trying to embed these ways of knowing into our school in a really meaningful way. And my expectation is not that every aspect of your school is going to be indigenized in these different ways, but it's how are we providing enough representation so one, those students feel comfortable in those spaces and they feel like they belong in those spaces. And then second, creating those ethical spaces for those students where it's a space they feel like they can come, be who they are, be heard, and be valued as well. So the first level of apprehension that we talked about saying the wrong thing, I think saying the wrong thing starts with knowing who we're talking about when we're using a word. And a lot of times early on with our undergrad students, they'll use some of these terms interchangeably when they mean fundamentally different things. So if we don't even know who we're talking about when we say a word, that's a way that we were worried about saying the wrong thing. And again, I have made these mistakes. I'll explain how I made these mistakes after we have a minute to figure out what they are. So let's take like a minute within your group, see how many of these you can define and say, who are we talking about when we use this term and when is it appropriate to use it? So let's take a minute or two, see how many we can come up with, and then we're going to come to a consensus on what these things mean.
I'll go.
All right, excellent.
So we kind of talked about how we'll use the word Indian in a historical context. So it is in our documents like the Indian Act, or when you said the Indian agent, because that is when we're talking about a specific time where they use those terms. But we kind of said we try and like teach the kids like when it is appropriate to use it, when it's not, and how maybe it's been misused as well in our society.
So if you mean historic, are you talking about only like documents that we speak of, or acts, or are we talking about people? So if I said like, would I say like my great grandfather was an Indian? Like if
Right,
people were talking, if people were talking about them, would you say that?
I don't think I would say that.
Yeah.
I think other people might say that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same with Native too. We didn't get to Native, but I think it's the same, kind of the same context. But yeah.
All right, so we're well on our way to the definition. I would say Indian, it was the term that was used generally till unfortunately not that long ago. So I would say like it was still pretty commonly used up into the 80s, late 80s even. It was a term that was pretty consistently used. We understand it was like a misunderstanding of the peoples who were actually from here when the first voyages from the New World were coming, or the Old World were coming to the New World. What they would call the Old World and New World. Expecting to find India, expecting to find these different places, and thinking that people from there were Indians. So I would say if we think of like, when is it appropriate to use it? I would say one, if you're speaking with someone from India, that's definitely appropriate in that context. I would say the act, if you're referring to the act, and if you're referring to like Indian agents and things like that, it's appropriate. Otherwise, if you're saying like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, don't say Indian, you're gonna avoid like half the problems right there. Just like don't use it and you're gonna be fine. The other thing is like internally within a lot of groups, like within my family, we would only refer to ourselves as Indians. We wouldn't refer to ourselves as any other ones. So it's like a lot of different culture groups where they've sort of reclaimed some of these terms, and it's acceptable internally, but not acceptable externally. So if one thing you're afraid of is, if you're on that first aspect of being afraid of saying the wrong thing, just don't use Indian, you're gonna be all right. It's one of the, and I'm sure most people know that already. All right, let's go to the next one. It gets more complicated here. First Nation, what does it mean? And who are we talking about when we use the term First Nation? Who fits within that definition of being First Nation? I want to take a shot?
We skipped over that one.
All right.
I thought I had an answer, but I'm confused why Inuit aren't included in First Nation, and so that's where I...
All right, so what was the answer that you had for First Nation before you got confused?
Well, I would think First Nation would be, kind of a blanket for, the indigenous population of North America.
All right, so not quite accurate?
But not in Métis. The reason I would exclude Métis is because that includes the French.
So not quite accurate. There's missing some elements of it. Well, anybody else want to take a guess of like who we're talking about when if I said for some First Nation students, what would be some characteristics that we would expect, or what would be some criteria that we'd expect they would fit within if I said First Nation students in your school?
Stuff they've identified, the family has identified that they are Indigenous?
Sort of. We're still a little bit short of it. There's an aspect of it that we're missing out on that you need to be included with to be defined as being First Nation. I'll give you a hint. I am First Nation, if that helps anything. So I can help you here. So First Nation is a government designation that defines who fits within the specific criteria of being identified as First Nation. So the government set out criteria through the Indian Act of you need to have this amount of Indigenous heritage, you need to be this close to, these family members have to have status as well. So when you think of having status, that's being First Nation. So it says, like I have a status card that says I'm a status Indian, that would deem that I'm First Nation. And the way in which the Indian Act was designed was to be very patriarchal. So like historically, if women who were First Nation married a non-First Nation man, they lost their status, and vice versa. If a non-Indigenous woman married a First Nation man, she would get status then. So that was until the early 80s, and there was a couple of big cases that overturned that and started getting status back for some of those women. In addition, First Nations people would lose their status if they joined the military, went to university, took a bunch of different types of jobs. All these different things you have to revoke your status in order to get those. And a lot of people didn't realize this during World War II and went and fought in World War II and came back and were not allowed to go back to their communities because they lost their status in the interim. So it's a bunch of different reasons why. So this is First Nation is a government designation that says you fit within the criteria of what it means to be status under the Indian Act. And under that criteria, historically were a lot of limitations, and now there are certain rights that come along with that as well. Certain like hunting rights, certain rights to living on reserved territory and those different things. So First Nation means you fit within the criteria to be deemed First Nation by the government. And even though I am First Nation, I would never refer to myself as that because that gives away to the government the right to define who I am. Instead, I define myself by being Decaf. I define myself by being within the Potlatch system because that's us defining for ourselves who's in our community rather than outside. But if you're using First Nation, it's really important that you know the people or person you're referring to has status and fits within that criteria, or you might be using an incorrect term, which I have done in the past, using the term First Nation when I was in my early 20s, I was talking to some group and talking about First Nations, and they were like, actually, we are non-status. So I was like not talking about the group that they belong to. So in this, about saying the wrong thing, just be 100% sure that the people or the group you're talking to like fits within that criteria. And typically another aspect of being First Nation is having connection to a specific band as well. So you fit within the criteria of being First Nation under the Indian Act, but then you also have a connection to a community, and that it's like an official connection, not just a informal connection. So that's really important. It's a government designation fitting within a specific criteria. All right, let's go to Métis now. Yeah.
So, you talked about how the changes that were made.
Yeah.
So is your mom considered First Nation then? She's not.
My parents never got married, so, and they would have gotten married. They could have got married in time actually. My mom married my dad before my older brother was born. She would have been First Nation, which is crazy for me to think about. My uncle married a woman and she got her status, and then she got into Harvard. Part of the reason why she got into Harvard was she applied as a First Nations person, and then our band paid for them, and then she left my uncle. So was able, she could have been totally justified in leaving him, I'm sure, but it's really interesting of like those people, and she gets First Nation, like she gets that for the rest of her life, so she's still deemed a First Nations person, and she has like no ancestry whatsoever. So it's really a patriarchal system, and it's interesting because it's so opposite to a lot of other Indigenous communities. So being matriarchal, and then the status actually goes through your father. Then it is no relevance to us as an actual people. It's really fascinating, really problematic. All right, let's go to Métis. What's the definition or definitions of being Métis? Who are we talking about when we use the word Métis?
Well, we were talking about how there's big M, and then little MET, and there's political and legal.
Yeah.
And we had talked about you need to come from the Red River colony to be able to prove it with either script, documentation, or your genealogy. Because the little MET is a mixture.
Yeah.
But the legal big MET is the Red River colony.
Excellent, perfect. So the big M and little METs, the big M is you have connections to these specific settlements. It's a unique culture to itself, so it's not just like mixed heritage. And then the other group of people with a smaller MET, it's sort of anybody who doesn't fit that criteria of being First Nation yet has an Indigenous ancestry. And within those groups, between those groups, there can be some serious disagreements over who gets to call themselves Métis and who doesn't. The scholars in my faculty, 3 of them align with like being big M Métis, and another one aligns with being small M Métis, and they do not get along very well. There's a lot of reasons why they have big differences in what they see as being Métis. I was reviewing a candidacy paper for a student not too long ago, and he was writing about himself, and he identified as, he used big M Métis and said, I'm Mohawk Métis. So obviously he was referring to small M Métis, but wrote it as big M. And like I had to talk to him and saying like, when you write it like this, it seems like you don't know what you're talking about. So it's important that you understand like what you're claiming when you're saying this. So this is very important to think of those two sides. Like I personally like don't get into that debate. I lay out what the debate is and step back from it as not to get involved, because like being First Nation, it's not my place to define what that is for people, but it's important to understand there's just two different. Yep.
Jen, can you go over that again? Just
Like what I did, okay.
Yeah.
So with the big MET, that you have to have be able to trace your genealogy to the rhetoric colony, versus small MAT is any like the mixture of any kind of Indigenous group with
But not meeting the criteria for being First Nation.
and
Because because I'm mixed. I'm half Indigenous and half non-Indigenous, but I'm not Métis because I'm First Nation. So like I meet the criteria that is established for being First Nation. But if I had a child and then I don't think my child would have status. Oh wait, they would. And then if their child, they would have ancestry, but they wouldn't be Métis because they don't have a connection to the settlement. They have a connection to my reserve. So they would be non-status Indigenous person.
Thanks.
All right, Native. Who are we? What does it mean when we say Native, and is it appropriate to use? I'm gonna answer this one for you because we need to get through these. Native is a term that started being used. It was the politically correct term that came after Indian. So like in the late 80s and early 90s, it was like, it's probably inappropriate to use as Indian. They're not from India, they're not Indians. So Native was like the next politically correct term that was used. There's some communities, some like different reserves and different reservations. So in Canada, we call them reserves. In the States, they call them reservations. There's some places where they use that term primarily to refer to themselves. So much like certain groups would call them, like certain communities would call themselves Indian. I know a lot of different nations where they refer to themselves as Native. I would say if you use the term Native, you're probably not going to be offensive, but it might sound a little anachronistic, I would say. So probably not the term you would go for, but you're probably not going to hurt anybody. You're not going to make anybody especially mad if you use that term, I would say. All right, Inuit. Somebody want to tell us who the Inuit are? Who would be referring to when we're using that term?
Do they have like a very specific culture, like kind of like Métis? And is it generally like northern communities?
Yeah, so it's
But it is a very significant cultural difference just in terms of like food and clothing and the way that they live.
Yeah, so it's a unique Indigenous culture within Canada that is separated from First Nation. So like you still need to have the specific things to be identified as being Inuit from the government perspective, but they see it as a unique cultural group within Canada. It's sort of on par, I guess, in a weird way of thinking about it with like First Nation, but an entirely different group. But it's in the north, but also like if you go like Labrador, in areas of Labrador, there's Nunatsiavut and different populations there. So it's a different group is the way you would think about it. All right, and Aboriginal and, yeah.
Question, and it's not on your list here, but we had an old picture book in Eskimo, right?
Yeah.
Then would we be better to then refer to, like go from Eskimo to Inuit?
Yeah, it would be a good thing to like burn that book first of all.
I just remember it came up and it was brought forward.
Yeah, it's from my understanding, it's an offensive term used to define the Inuit people. And a friend of mine who I was in New Zealand last year at a land-based conference, and I met somebody from Greenland, and she was Inuit from Greenland, and she was saying how like a lot of the people from Greenland moved to Denmark afterwards, like because there's not a lot of options available in Greenland for work or different things. And she was saying like a lot of them get referred to as Eskimos when they're in Denmark, and they said it's like a really problematic way of referring to them. A lot of times, like much like carrier, people will hear a definition from another group or define them incorrectly. Like in Calgary, the Tsuut'ina were called Sarsi for a while. And Sarsi is actually the word that the Blackfoot people would use to make fun of the people from Tsuut'ina. And then when some of the first settlers came through, they heard them using that term about them, and that's what they thought their definition or their name was. It was actually like a misunderstanding, and I think the term Eskimo has a similar lineage, and it's sort of a problematic way of viewing it. Excellent, thanks for the question. So Aboriginal and Indigenous, these are the most expansive terms. Some people they can be used interchangeably somewhat. Some people have a problem with Aboriginal because like the etymological roots of it. I don't get too deep into those like pedantic debates about that stuff, to be honest. I think we have bigger issues to talk about. But like I typically would use the term Indigenous rather than Aboriginal, just because you're not going to offend anybody. And when you're using the term Indigenous, for one thing, it can mean anybody around the world. So like an Indigenous person, the way it's typically defined is anybody who's originally from a place and then that place was colonized. So there has to be that element of colonization for people to be Indigenous from an area. Although when I went I gave lectures in November at University College London and University of Edinburgh, and when I got there, I acknowledged the traditional peoples of the territory in which I was on, and it was like, I think the first time they ever heard that. And it was a really interesting experience. They had like so many questions about that afterwards, of like me acknowledging the land and the people who were there before. And then there's like plenty of places, like you could say there's Indigenous people in Scotland because they were colonized in Ireland as well. So there's plenty of like colonial occurrences in those spaces as well. But Indigenous typically means like the original people from a place that was eventually colonized. But then if we think of it in the Canadian context of Indigenous Canadians, it's expansive, so it includes all of those other terms. So if we think of the three major groups, the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit, if you say Indigenous, it encapsulates everybody. So it's the safest term to use because you're going to be accurate if you know that person's Indigenous. If you're saying Indigenous peoples, it doesn't matter if they're First Nation, Métis, or Inuit, it includes them all. So again, if you're worried about saying the wrong thing, you can use this sort of general term of Indigenous to include people. And it's typically the way I'd refer to myself, and the way that I would, if I'm not saying my specific nation that I come from, I'd be referring to myself as Indigenous. Any questions about those? Yeah.
We often hear the NMI, and I know that's a term that's used a lot.
Yeah.
Seems to kind of be lost when we talk about Indigenous, and that seems to be the better term. Is that what you're seeing? Like, I know that.
Yeah, we made a big push for our university to change our course from FNMI education to Indigenous education. So there seems to be like going in that direction, but there's times when you do have to use these terms specifically. So like it's necessary. So like writing a paper talking about on-reserve students, it's important that I'm differentiating about First Nation students rather than Indigenous, because those experiences might be different depending on the school they're going through, their context and things like that. And there's a differentiation between those experiences between Métis students and First Nation students. We know this, the data tells us Métis students are doing significantly better in education than First Nation students. So if you're thinking about a program that's directly targeting that group, it's important to like be intentional about that language. Excellent. All right, so move on to think about some ways in which we think about this work. And I think the thing we often hear is, these conversations about reconciliation. People talk about responses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and thinking about what those are. And some of the schools I go to and some of the organizations I go to, they tell me like the work that they're doing, they see as fundamentally reconciliation work. And to me, I ask them a couple questions. I say, well, one, what do you mean by that? Second, what sort of truth are we coming to? And then what are we reconciling for? So those things are really important for me to think about when we have these conversations, because I often think when people are reconciling when I ask them that, normally they say, oh, for the residential school system is what they're reconciling for. And from my perspective, the residential school is one manifestation of colonization. It's not the only aspect of that. And if we only see that, and if we only think about that, we're missing out on some really important and critical elements of understanding what the truth actually is and what we're trying to reconcile for. And then in addition to that, when we talk about reconciliation, even within that institution, people often talk about like the physical and sexual abuse that happen in those systems. And it's really important that those discussions are had. It's really important that those are brought out. But if we only talk about those, we're missing about the foundational principles of those. And the foundational principles of those systems is they were designed to eliminate Indigenous people's culture or ways of being from their experiences. It's to separate them as much as they can from their own past, from their own cultural traditions, their own ways of being. And that fundamentally is what colonization is. It's telling it, the way you are is not good enough. You need to be like we are. You need to, the way in which you think, the way in which you behave in this world, you need to shift that to being more like us. That's the foundational principle of residential schools. So if we think about that, well, we can see those represented in other systems as well. So within the legal system, there's a really great book by Lisa Monchalin called The Colonial Problem, and it talks about Indigenous people's experiences in the justice system. And it talks about how, the way in which you represent being honest, the ways in which you represent contrition, the ways in which you represent guilt, they're different from culture to culture. And the expectation is for Indigenous peoples and people of all different cultures is that we have to align ourselves with the ways in which the dominant culture does that in order to be heard, in order to be understood within that system. That's another representation of that colonial perspective of you have to do things the way in which we do things, the way in which we think in order to be valued within this country. We can think of like the healthcare system, all these different things. Contemporary schooling, like is there still a requirement for Indigenous students to align themselves with Western ways of thinking in order to be successful? There is. is there opportunities for them to represent that with their own ways of thinking? In a lot of schools, that's very rare because we just don't have the skills, the tools to do that right now. So I would say those fundamental problems that existed in residential schools are still around today. And if we're only thinking about reconciliation with the past, then we're ignoring those ways in which those things are still prevalent in society today. And we're ignoring the ways in which we really need to take up this work. And this is really challenging. Like, again, my point of sharing this with you is not saying, I can't believe you're not reconciling for these other things. Like, these things we're all learning along the way. I didn't even know residential schools existed until I was 20 years old. My grandmother went to one. I drove by one almost on a daily basis. Lived across the street from one for a long time. It was just like not discussed until I'd say the late 90s, early 2000s. It was not discussed ever. I've never heard a single family member of mine talk about their experience at residential school. They just do not share it. So it was not widely known. So this is like a really emerging field that we're talking about. So we're not that long ago just understanding the reality of these institutions, and now we're trying to get to the more complex elements of how they played out, the impacts they had on students. So there's so many complicated things that we don't think about in these systems that still have impact on Indigenous youth. One of them is parenting practices. So if you take kids out of a community for 100, 150 years, you don't get those parenting traditions that have been used for thousands of years get erased. And then how do people learn how to parent? Well, the psychological research tells us we model our parenting based on how we were parented to some extent. And if your parenting was in those residential schools, the parenting that was modeled to you is cold, shaming, and often abusive behavior. So we see that being reenacted by Indigenous parents now in some generations because that's what they experienced as well. In addition, I was doing some work in northern Alberta, and I went to this Cree community and we were talking about getting language into the school, and they said, well, we had a language teacher set up and we had all this funding for this program, and the day that the language teacher was turning up, a bunch of the Cree members of the community blocked the door and wouldn't let them come in to teach. And I was saying, look, why would they do that? And they said, well, there was a new preacher that came through in the last 5 years and the community was born again. And that preacher told the community that Cree traditions and language are the devil's language and the devil's traditions. So the people bought into that, and then the Cree members of the community physically blocked the Cree teacher from coming in because they believed that any of their traditions were aligned with the ideas of being in league with the devil in some way. And then, like, those things are still living on even if they're not being pushed in communities still, where when I was young, in my community, in town, so there was a couple of reserves that were sort of further away from town, and they had some of the more traditional aspects of Daggett culture still there. And some of the medicine men had been kicked out because through residential school system, they were convinced that these guys were the most dangerous ones, these ones connected to spirituality, because they were seen as being in league with the devil in these different ways. So they were kicked out of the community, these traditional knowledge keepers. And then when they would drive through town, I would see like the kids in the school, all the Indigenous kids would like look away and hide when those people were coming through because their parents had told them like these people to be afraid of. So those things, like these other elements of it that we don't think of, are still having an impact on Indigenous people today. And I was going to do a research project where I was going to go to those communities and document these things happening, and then go to the churches and tell them, well, if you're apologizing for a residential school system, we need to think about ways to actually begin changing these outcomes. And one of the ways is you should support your members in learning their traditional languages and telling them this is something that is totally acceptable and we support you doing. I was getting ready for a battle, but other research came up and I didn't end up doing it, but that's research I'd still like to do. So I was thinking about what are those other elements we need to reconcile for. It's not just the abuse that happened in those schools, it's what are those other manifestations of it outside of residential schools, and what are the more complex elements within those schools as well that we need to think about. And one of the definitions I like to use of reconciliation is by Judge Murray Sinclair, where he says reconciliation is about creating a relationship of mutual respect. So if that's the state we're trying to get to, what are the things we can do that can achieve that within our school systems? What are the things we can do within our classrooms to achieve that relationship of mutual respect? Sort of for me, it aligns with that idea of ethical spaces. Reconciliation is not an apology. It's not something we're just saying sorry for. It's how are we changing the ways in which we're interacting with one another? How are we changing the ways in which individually and systemically our two cultures are coming together in these different ways? To me, that's really reconciliation. It's not just these series of apologies. It's how are we changing the ways we're actually existing together? For me, that's what we're trying to get to. So these next two terms are when I go places, they're consistently used interchangeably. And for me, understanding this work is understanding what these mean and then understanding how we can begin to use them. So decolonizing or indigenizing, again, oftentimes, so often, I'll just read people when they're writing about it and they'll just use these interchangeably. They mean something fundamentally different. And it's important to understand those. So we're gonna get in deep into those definitions with you so you understand the work that we're doing. I always think that any work you're doing towards reconciliation, these are the mechanisms we're using in order to get there. It's either decolonizing projects or indigenizing projects that we're using to get there. And the first step to actually making those changes is thinking about, am I doing a decolonizing project or am I doing an indigenizing project within the school that I'm working in, the classroom that I'm working within? Does anybody know who any of these three people are by any chance? So on the left is Frantz Fanon. He's like a real significant scholar. He's born in Martinique in the Caribbean, moved to France, ended up becoming a medical doctor, then became a psychologist. For his dissertation, he wrote this book called Blackface, White Mask. Was about the psychological experiences of the African diaspora in colonial spaces. And I think none of us can expect that our dissertation is going to have as much of an impact as his dissertation had. It was like really transformational in the way people thought about African French folks and their experiences, or just African Americans, different places around the world, and their experiences in psychology, and the ways in which their experiences are often misdiagnosed. He was talking about specifically about hysteria, about how people were diagnosed with hysteria, but it was their reasonable psychological response to living in an unbelievably oppressive environment. It was really, really important. But then he went and wrote a book after that called Wretched of the Earth. And he was a medical doctor, then he moved down to Algeria during the Algerian Revolution, and in his spare time he wrote philosophy. And the philosophy that he wrote in his spare time is the foundation for a lot of the work that people do in this area. And he died when he was a year younger than I am right now. So he achieved a significant amount in his life, in a pretty young life. He died of leukemia. Then over in the middle is Linda Twice-Smith. She's a Maori scholar. She wrote this book called Decolonizing Methodologies. Completely foundational work in the area of Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous people in the academy, Indigenous research. Up until that point, we talk about those, we were talking about reconciliation and what we're reconciling for. What she did was, up until she wrote that book in the late 90s, it was almost impossible for Indigenous people in the academy to do research based on their own ways of knowing. They had to use Western ways of thinking, Western ways of being in order to conduct research in those spaces. She wrote this book and that really challenged that for the first time. And what she argued is research is historically a colonial act. And what she meant by that was that researchers typically, what they do is they go into a community and say, here's what the problem is here. Here's the questions I'm going to ask about that problem. Here's the way in which we're going to interact when I'm gathering this data or doing this research, and then here's what I'm going to do with this knowledge when I'm finished. And what she argued is that's fundamentally a colonial act, because it's somebody coming in from the outside and saying, here's your problem, here's how we're going to engage to figure out the answers to that problem, and here's what I'm going to do with it. And what she argues is that the process of research needs to be empowering. You can't expect the outcomes to be. So if I'm going into a community doing research on FASD in a community, I can't expect the outcomes of my research are going to be impactful, because who knows what happens with that research I do. I could make a huge mistake along the way, the data could be inconclusive, all these different things. What she argues is the actual process of research needs to be empowering. How are you making connections with that community? How are you defining what the problem is? How are you defining what the questions are going to be collaboratively? How are those actual interviews that you're conducting? How are those empowering and beneficial to the community? You can't expect it to be the outcomes. That book she wrote was transformational. Anybody who does Indigenous scholarship uses her work as sort of foundational, I would say. It's really, really important stuff. Then the last one, Marie Baptiste. She's a Mi'kmaq scholar. She teaches at U of S. She's written a number of articles and books that are sort of pretty foundational in terms of Indigenous education within Canada. Just a massive, massive scholar still working. And the great thing about people like Marie Baptiste and Linda Twice-Smith is you can just email them and they'll email you back. So they're real superstars in the field, and it's amazing how generous they are with their time and the ways in which they're willing to support you. All right, so let's get into defining these two terms and understanding the differences between the two of them. Someone want to volunteer to read this first one for us? All right.
Decolonization, which has been defined by Day
Yeah.
as breaking with the ways in which the Indigenous human condition is defined and shaped by dominant Euro-American cultures.
Thank you. So George Day is a professor at U of T. So there's two aspects of decolonization, and this one's the first one. There's two really important aspects of what colonization and decolonization are. First one is this one, where as, decolonization, what Day says, as breaking with the ways to which the Indigenous human condition is defined and shaped by a dominant Euro-American culture. So one aspect of colonization is it requires Indigenous peoples to see themselves through the lens of Western folks or Western ways of thinking. So it's a Western gaze that's used to view indigeneity. Another way of thinking of this is Western neutrality of knowledge. So the ways in which we think about knowledge is the ways in which the West thinks of things is we think of as often the default way in which humans view the world. And then everybody else we see as being diverse. The ways in which Western European experience is the natural or the way of human existence. Everybody else is diverse outside of that. A decolonial space is when we get to a space where folks from Western Europe, Western European ways of thinking are seen as an aspect of diversity. Right now, they're not seen as, if we talk about like attending to diverse students in classrooms, we do not think of those white kids in your classroom often who are like have English heritage or whatever it is. We think of those other students as being diverse. Well, this way of thinking aligns with this sort of idea of Western neutrality of knowledge. This is the foundational knowledge in the world and everything else is different. So we're going to view the world through the gaze of that neutral knowledge. Decolonizing is challenging that. It's challenging the ways in which we view things only through a Western way of. So it's like one way of thinking of that, a very superficial way of thinking about it, is if you talk about like going somewhere else where they drive on the other side of the road and we say like they drive on the wrong side of the road. So like that's the way of thinking. We do things the right way and this is them doing things the wrong way. So the really important thing about colonial mentalities is they've been so deeply ingrained in us for so long that we're unaware that we even have them. And that's the fundamental aspect of colonization and the fundamental strength of colonization is it leads people to not even realize that we have this view of the world of these are the natural way of being and these are the diverse ways, these are the other ways of being. That's the first aspect of colonization and decolonization. Someone want to volunteer to read this one for us? Yep.
Assimilation was frequently but another name for the very special brand of relationship between human beings which had been imposed by colonialism. These relations deemed that the individual torn from the context to which he owed his identity should replace his habits of feeling, thinking, and acting by another set of habits which belonged to the strangers who dominated him. Baldwin, 1954.
Thank you. So this to me is like the best definition I've ever read of what either assimilation or colonization is. And this part of Baldwin's statement where he says, these relations demand that the individual, torn from the context to which he owed his identity, should replace his habits of feeling, thinking, and acting by another set of habits which belong to the strangers who dominated him. That to me is like the foundational definition of what colonization is. It's asking people the way in which you think, the way in which you exist in the world, the way in which you act, you need to replace those all in the way in which we feel, think, and act. The way in which the dominant culture feels, thinks, and acts. That's the foundation of colonization. Asking people to experience the world in the way that you do and do not experience the world in the way you do, and the way you naturally would, or the way in which your culture would do that. That's the foundation to me of residential schools. That's the foundation of the colonial system. It's saying, we need you to come into here and we're going to teach you how to feel, think, and act in the way that we do until that's so natural, that's your only way of being. And that's that other really important aspect of colonization. And if we think of decolonization, well, how are we challenging that? How are we challenging the ways in which we expect people to only use this one way of feeling, thinking, and acting? How are we creating a system within our school where we don't require that of our students? We don't require our students to align with only one way of thinking in order to be acknowledged within that system, in order to be successful in that system as well. So decolonizing is how are we finding ways to challenge that? And again, the expectation is you're not going to know the way in which every culture does things. You're not going to know that, but how are you creating that space where you can learn those things, students feel comfortable being that, families feel comfortable coming into your school, and maybe a different way of interacting, different way of thinking about themselves. How are we challenging those things for the way in which our school operates? All right, now we have the last aspect of it. One more person to read this one for us, please. Yep.
For Smith, decolonization is the revitalization of the ways of being and knowing prior to colonization, while unearthing the manner in which colonization was achieved. It is not enough to simply reconnect with the past. In order to pursue decolonization, we must also untangle the complex web of internalized oppression created by colonization. Furthermore, decolonization requires the colonizer to recognize and challenge their own socialized presumptions of superiority.
Thank you. So it sounds complex. The way to break this down is sort of these last two sentences in this paragraph. So when it's stated that, where do we start here? It's not enough to simply reconnect with the past. In order to pursue decolonization, we must also untangle the complex web of internalized oppression, it's cut out on me, created by colonization. Furthermore, decolonization requires the colonizer to recognize and challenge their own socialized presumptions of superiority. So there's two parts of this. The one part is for the person who's colonized and the internalized oppression that gets created by that. So through those experiences within the living in a colonized society where you constantly get this message of you have to align yourself with our way of being in order to be heard, that creates a hierarchy that says this way of being is better than that way of being. So challenging that for the people who've gone through that system, and this sounds like people get a little apprehensive when you use this term, but fundamentally what that is challenging white supremacy. Like we hear that term white supremacy and we think of like very aggressive like clan members and things like that. But white supremacy is fundamentally just thinking of one as being superior than the other. So residential schools is a manifestation of white supremacy. It's saying you are not good enough the way you are, you need to be like this. That's saying this group is better than that group. That's fundamentally what white supremacy is. There's the way we do things in the justice system of saying that we're only using one way of being, one way of knowing in there. That's fundamentally an act of white supremacy as well. It's not as aggressive of a term as it sounds. And then what it's saying is for the colonized, they need to challenge that idea of white supremacy that they have. But similarly, for the colonizer, they need to challenge that internalized superiority needs to be challenged as well. How do we challenge for our other students, or our students who might come from settler backgrounds, how do we challenge that internalized presumption of superiority at the same time? So there's two aspects of decolonizing. The first is we're challenging the neutrality of Western knowledge and Western ways of being. The second half of decolonizing is we're challenging the assumptions of white supremacy. So there's two elements of those same things. And the difficulty is this can be tricky work to take up because people get really defensive when you bring up some of these terms. I was working with a school once, and I was going in to do like this sort of work, and somebody was doing a talk before me, and they were saying like, they talked about privilege, and some of the teachers like flipped out when someone used the word privilege. They're like, what, we're talking about privilege? And I was like, if you're upset now, just wait. And then it was a battle the whole way. But in addition to like that apprehension, because these terms can make people uncomfortable, the way in which this plays out is really tricky to be able to understand, and the ways in which to challenge this can be really challenging as well. So people are apprehensive both on an emotional level, but then on a practical level they get apprehensive because like, how do we actually begin doing this work? That's some of the stuff that we'll get into. All right, so if we understand decolonizing has those two elements where we're challenging the neutrality of Western knowledge, we're challenging Western supremacy. Those are the two elements of decolonizing. Then if we think of indigenizing, is incorporating Indigenous knowledges into the ways we interact, engage, operate, evaluate, make assumptions, and behave within a system. Indigenous education moves well beyond content in schools. So if we think of indigenizing, when we indigenize education, that's when we bring in Indigenous knowledges into our school system or into the ways we interact. So if I give you an example, when you do bring an elder into your classroom, that's an act of indigenizing. You're saying, let's bring Indigenous knowledges and use them within the system. If at the beginning of today we would have smudged, we don't do that in my territory, so I was at a meeting actually this week, and it's happened a couple of times where they'll like start a smudge and they're like, hey, do you want to lead us through this smudge? And I was like, well, we don't do that. I can give it a shot. I don't really know what I'm doing. But if we use a smudge at the beginning of this, that would be indigenizing, because we're taking Indigenous ways of knowing and we're embedding them within our system. Or if, if we use the circle in our classroom in a meaningful way to have our students be able to communicate with one another and share, that's an indigenizing process, because we're taking Indigenous knowledges and we're using them within the system and we're embedding them. So those are two fundamentally different things. The first is how we're looking inward and we're understanding ourselves and the system in which we operate within, and we're challenging the ways in which we view those. And the second is, once we've done that and created a space where Indigenous knowledges may be valued in a way that they wouldn't have been previously, we're then using those within that system. The difficulty is, most places go straight to indigenizing. Most places go straight to, let's take our students into a sweat, let's have an elder come in and share things with them. And that's great. But the decolonizing work needs to be done on the front end, or else this work is not going to land in fertile ground. This work is going to land in ground where we haven't challenged the ways in which we assume Western knowledge is neutral, the ways in which we assume Western ways of doing things are superior. And if they land there, they're not going to be taken up in a meaningful way in most cases, because it's still going to be unintentionally and unknown, very resistant spaces for this work to be done. So whenever I go to places and I say, like, what sort of work you're doing, I wanted to hear about it, almost all the work is pretty much all the work is indigenizing. There has not been that decolonial work of thinking about what are some ways we can first recognize some of the foundations within our system and then individually of a colonial mentality, and then what are the ways in which we can begin challenging them. I'm going to share with you one way in which you can begin doing that in your school environment. But it's an ongoing battle. Like, decolonizing is not like it's not an endpoint. It's a constant process, because we're still being constantly bombarded with colonial messaging. We're still being constantly bombarded with that, so we have to keep on challenging ourselves. I was in a defense and the student was talking about being decolonized, and that's not a space we get to. It's something it's just like, challenging our perspectives on heteronormativity or sexism. We're constantly being bombarded with sexist imagery, sexist ideas, so we're constantly having to challenge our own perspectives on that. Same with things like heteronormativity. So it's not a place we get to at the end, it's something we're constantly doing. So I would say it's more like a cyclical process between indigenizing and decolonizing, and we're constantly having to go back to challenge the ways in which we do things, the ways in which we think. Again, my expectation is not that everything you're going to do is going to be indigenized, not at all. It's just, how do we have some representation within our school systems, adequate representation so students can feel welcome. We can use other knowledge systems as foundations to learning, and they actually have great benefit to those students. It's not just something we're imposing on you. It's something that's actually going to benefit you as an educator. And once we get to that state of recognizing the benefits that these Indigenous knowledges can have to you as a teacher, that's when it gets really taken up in a meaningful way. Any questions about those two? That's a sort of complex theory that I'm trying to explain in like 15, 20 minutes. But anything you're unsure of, or any additional information you'd like to know about either of those two aspects of decolonizing or indigenizing? Yeah?
Well, I'm just thinking about like the subject area that I teach, so it's math science. So I feel like it's easier to bring in like indigenizing practices, so then how do I actually decolonize it in those subject areas?
So for me, when I think about indigenizing and decolonizing, I think of it, I don't think of it in the area of content, I think of it always in the area of process. So like the way whenever I work with a specific school, or if I work with a specific classroom, I get them to think about their lesson planning, and I think about them having a content goal and a process goal. So your content goal can be anything, whatever you're teaching, any class you're teaching, there can be a content goal. But then your process goal, what are the ways in which we're engaging and what are the ways in which we're learning? So that's how you begin decolonizing, by challenging those ways in which we only have one way or a couple of ways in which we begin to learn, and the couple of ways in which we engage with one another as well. So by decolonizing is by the pedagogical approach you might have to it, the level of hierarchy you might have in that. I'm going to share a little bit later one of the methods that I used within my classroom to do that, to decolonize those spaces. But I think, like, regardless of whichever class it is, I think that pedagogy and that process and those levels of engagement can be challenged no matter what it is. And whether the content, and I think it's really impactful when people start to recognize the impacts that Indigenous pedagogies can have in non-Indigenous subjects, seeming subjects. And for our STEM teachers, that tends to be the biggest challenge. But I think those same pedagogies can be used in those ways, and I'm going to share some of those with you in a little bit. Excellent question, though. Any other questions or anything else we're unclear of based on those two definitions? All right, so just remembering 2 aspects of decolonization. First one, the way in which Western knowledge is seen as being neutral. The second one, the way in which Western knowledge is seen as being superior. How are we challenging those within our system? That's the decolonial project. The indigenizing project is how are we bringing in indigenous knowledges and using those within our system. So 2 different aspects of it, and being very intentional and thinking when you develop projects to work on this, are you doing a decolonizing project or are you doing an indigenizing project? And if so, have you done the necessary decolonizing work on the front end so that indigenizing project has the potential of actually being successful in that space as well? So this is a model that I use, that I developed based on combining 2 other models in order for finding ways to think about the aspects of your school or think about the aspects of your classroom that actually do need to be decolonized, and what are the ways in which oppression typically plays out within these spaces. So this is Horkheimer. So Horkheimer is a critical theorist it's based in Germany. It's a way of seeing the world, but I turned this into an action-oriented theory by using it with my students and then using it as a roadmap for their own approach in their classroom. And then I combined it with Blackfoot, Leroy Littlebear's Blackfoot approach to it. So stuff's going to read really complex, but it's actually pretty simple. And I changed it a little bit, but fundamentally these are 3 different steps, and I see these as being sequential in a lot of ways. So you can't get to the second and third until you've done the first step. So the first step argues that despite living in a democracy that we think of as being equal, we actually live in an unequal society. And this is based on a number of indicators like race, gender, class, ability, orientation. All these different aspects lead to certain groups having advantages and certain groups having disadvantages. So a simple way of thinking about this is using an example of the justice system. So the greatest indicator of being successful in the justice system is being rich. There's no greater indicator that we have. The best situation you can be in if you have to go in the justice system is be rich. By far the greatest indicator. You can hire a great lawyer. You don't have to stay in jail. You can get out on bail. They're going to have certain assumptions about you based on the clothes you're wearing into court, the job you have, the title you have. Being rich is by far the greatest indicator of success within our society. So we understand the world is not an equal place. Being rich gives you huge advantages within the justice system. We know that having different levels of ability give you different levels of advantage within the school system, within the job market, all these things. We know that women get paid something like 72 cents on the dollar compared to men. There's certain advantages that certain groups get over other groups in society. It's a fundamental reality of the society we live in. So that's the first assumption of critical theory. And if we think about this as an active way of approaching it, how can we begin recognizing those things in our classroom? How can we recognize the surface level ways in which certain groups get advantages and certain groups get disadvantages within our classroom? So if we use that same example of class, we know students who come from a wealthier background on the surface level have greater access to tutoring. They have greater access to summer programs so that if summer is longer in that school, those students who come from poorer backgrounds are going to there's going to be a bigger divide in their success when they come back into school. There's these like surface level things we know are advantages some students have over advantages other students have. If we go to the second aspect of critical theory, what Horkheimer argues is the way that oppression typically, and I've made a bit of an amendment to this, but the way oppression typically happens in our society is invisible and normalized. Most of the ways that racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, ableism, all these things play out is invisible and normalized. Invisible to the person who's oppressing and often invisible to the person who's being oppressed at the same time. Most of the way oppression happens is not somebody saying, I do not like people of color, I'm going to go oppress this person in a certain way. It's the person who's unaware that they're colluding with those ideas. So if we go back to those ideas of colonization, we don't know the ways in which we've been trained and socialized to have different expectations for different groups. We don't know the ways in which we've been trained to have different expectations for people of different genders. We've been trained our whole lives through media representations, through all these different things, education, all these different things to have different expectations for these different groups. And we unknowingly enact them when we're working with people and when we're interacting with people on a daily basis. So if we think of the second aspect, well, what are the ways in which we can recognize in our classroom the invisible and normalized ways in which oppression is happening in that class? So I can give you a couple of examples. Research shows that teachers typically have an easier time creating strong relationships with students from middle class backgrounds. Research says because most teachers are middle class themselves and come from a middle class background, it's just an easier time developing a strong relationship. So that's invisible to us. We do not know, we can't see the student and think, well, they're coming from a poorer background, I'm gonna have a harder time making a relationship. That's not something we think about. So that's invisible to us, that we're having a harder time developing that relationship with that student over that student. Another way we can think about it is we know that we have different expectations for students based on their background, based on their class background. So we may have very high expectations for a student who's coming from a wealthy background. There's no information that we have that should give us that high expectation, just that they come from a wealthy family, so we make that assumption. And we don't know that we have that expectation, and we don't know that expectation is leading to different outcomes for those students. And research shows we all do this. The thing that we hear is we have teachers, both in-service and pre-service teachers, saying like, I treat everyone the same. No, you don't. I guarantee you don't. We treat people differently based on so many different indicators. There's research out there that shows that parents treat their more attractive children better than their less attractive children. So like no matter what it is, we treat people differently. In addition, I hope we don't treat everybody the same, because all of our students don't need the same thing. Some of our students need different approaches to it. So this second aspect is the aspect that's the hardest for the pre-service teachers that we work with, because in order to understand that the oppression mostly plays out in invisible and normalized ways, we have to recognize that we have colluded those ideas. Probably today, most of us have colluded these ideas. We're all subjected to this, and we all need to recognize the ways in which invisibility and normalization lead us to oppressing students, things we can't even realize right now. It's way more important to be reflective and notice the ways we do it, rather than to continue to deny that we actually colluded these ideas. And again, it comes down to that binary way of thinking. It comes down to, if I recognize that I've colluded with these ideas or unintentionally oppress somebody, then I have to see myself as a racist, and I'm no longer a good person. But in reality, that's not how oppression plays out. That's not how racism plays out. We all fall somewhere on that spectrum, and we've all colluded with these ideas in one way or another, and it's something we're constantly having to battle with. So the third aspect is, it's not enough to know inequality exists. It's not enough to know that the way it plays out most of the time is invisible and normalized. We need to actually do something about it. We need to act on these things. And the problem is, a lot of times, especially with pre-service teachers, actually it's just as much with in-service teachers, is we want to jump to this area. We want to jump to number 3 and say, tell me what to do. What are we going to do to attend to this? Well, we don't know what the problem is yet, and we don't know the ways in which it's happening in invisible and normalized ways. So if we just attend to it, maybe we're attending to the wrong thing. And we need to do that hard work of understanding what are the ways in which oppression is playing out. And maybe that's something that you're not going to be able to understand just yourself. You need to work with a bunch of other people who might be in this community, do a lot of reading in different areas to understand what are the ways in which these oppression is playing out. So the way we did this for students of different class background, we could do the same modeling for students in Indigenous backgrounds. What are the ways in the surface level that we know oppression is playing out in our school system for Indigenous learners? Well, for some of them who are coming from the reserve, they have to be bussed in. For some of them, they're treated differently than the other students when they're coming from the reserve communities. All these different things. Get to the next level. What are the ways in which it's invisible and normalized for the students in the school? Well, maybe their way of knowing is not represented in any of the pedagogy in this school system. What is that one of the ways in which it's invisible oppression is playing out towards these students? Maybe there's no representation within the leadership or within teachers of people from their background as well. So it's a modeling of them. You know, a lot of schools we see that I go and work with, they'll be, especially on reserve schools, they'll have a lot of teaching EA staff who are Indigenous, and then no teaching staff or leadership who are Indigenous. So that's modeling for those students. This is the expectation for you, is like maybe you can get to this lowest level within the school. These higher levels aren't accessible. That's one of the ways in which oppression is invisible and normalized within that school system. And by attending to these issues, this third aspect, it's not just ending them, but for those invisible and normalized things, how are we bringing them to the surface and allowing people to see them? Rather than, maybe we can't end those things, maybe we can bring them to the surface and no longer allow them to be invisible and normalized. So what I've done then, adding on to this model is adding Leroy Littlebear's work. So what he argues is that, he says that Blackfoot people, but Indigenous folks in general, most Indigenous communities in the Americas have a view of the world that includes this idea of constant flux. And that idea of constant flux, he argues, is viewing the world as a dynamic place. Nothing stays the same. What he says is that, us as human beings, we're either like deteriorating or like developing in these different ways. The relationships we have with people, they're constantly changing. Nothing is staying dynamic. The land around us, everything we know around us is constantly dynamic. There's no static, the world is not a static place in any way. Things are constantly changing. So what he says is the way in which Indigenous people view knowledge as being is temporal and spatial. We have knowledge that makes sense in this place and time right now. And this knowledge makes sense for us, for the makeup of the world around us, for how we are as a person right now, for our relationships. This way of living makes sense and works for the situation we're in right now. But what he says is since the world's changing, the way in which we exist in the world may not work in 6 months, a year, 5, 10 years from now. The world might have changed so much around us that this way of being might not work anymore or might not be valid. This knowledge we have isn't valid anymore. So what he says is, for Indigenous peoples, there's a requirement of renewing knowledge on a consistent basis to see if it's still valid. So what he says is the reason why the Blackfoot have their specific ceremonies at the different times of the year is to see if that knowledge is still valid that they had last year. To see if their relationships and the way they had them are still the way in which they were, what changes need to be made. It's constantly rechecking that knowledge. So we can think of like the relationships we've had in our lives, the different times of our lives, how we would have responded totally differently to something. And maybe that's not incorrect. Maybe it's just given that space and time, that was the appropriate way to respond to that. So similarly to that Blackfoot way of thinking or Indigenous way of thinking, we need to do the same when we're understanding the ways in which oppression happens in our classroom. Because those things are not static either, they're very dynamic. So even though it's like a decently long time frame, if we think of the experiences of students from different sexual orientational backgrounds, when I was in high school, I graduated in 1999, it was just completely acceptable. Homophobia was completely acceptable in my school that I was going to. Students didn't get challenged by each other. We didn't challenge each other in any way. Not really challenged by teachers when people would use homophobic language. If we had to map this out for those students, we would see a lot of the stuff on the very surface. It's just completely acceptable to be homophobic in this space. There would still be aspects that are invisible and normalized, but a lot of that would be existing up in the top. So if you're attending to that, you have to be trying to challenge those the appropriateness of using those terms, of thinking that way, of acting that, of being homophobic and challenging those things. That's what we'd be doing in action. But if you just kept on behaving that way and didn't change the way in which we were challenging those, we wouldn't realize the different ways in which oppression is manifesting for students of different backgrounds. And we would just be behaving based on the way it was historically. And now going to those schools and doing work with them, it's an entirely different approach. They have lots of staff who are really well grounded in this knowledge, really well grounded in these approaches. So what we would find would be totally different in terms of understanding, mapping out oppression in that school, and the responses we would need to make would be totally different. That similarly works on like a yearly basis. So say you wanted to take up some of this work of decolonizing in your school, you mapped out the ways in which it's happening, mapped out the ways in which it's invisible and normalized, developed an action plan. You need to go back and revisit that 6 months, a year from now, because maybe you solved some of those problems. Maybe new things have emerged that you wouldn't even have considered based on technology, social media, all these different things. Maybe the environment around you has changed. Maybe something about the band, the nearest reserve has changed fundamentally, and there's something new you need to do in that school system. So this is one model that you can use that can begin helping you understand, mapping out some of the ways oppression is happening, and then developing an action plan to begin to attend to that. So I know we're pretty close to being done, but I want to give you a couple minute break and we'll go really hard for the last half an hour. So let's take 5 or 6 minutes, come back and we'll finish strong. School, and I gave them the same talk where it's we need to do decolonizing before we do indigenizing. And then I went to this school and they were saying, it's all First Nations teachers, and we know who I'm talking about when I say First Nations, fit within the criteria of the Indian Act, have a connection to a specific reserve. All First Nations teachers at the school, all First Nations students at the school, and I went to them and said well, we need to start with decolonizing, because it's a 4-year project I'm on. I'm saying, let's spend the first 6 months doing decolonizing work in the school. And they're they would have said, we're all Indians here, we don't need to do this work. We understand, we don't have this internalized oppression. We don't think that Western ways of doing things are superior. We don't require ourselves to align with Western ways of thinking. They didn't use that language. I'm using the language I would use to explain that. They said, we don't need to do it because we get it. We don't fall within that. And I said, well, I promise you do. I promise you we all need to do this work. Decolonizing is important for everybody. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. Let's just go right to the indigenizing stuff. And I was like, well, I'm a researcher, so I'm going to research my way out of this. So what I did is I did this research study based on some of the work one of my colleagues did in a different area, but I sort of translated it into this. And it was the study that's basically helps us understand communal self-esteem. So we usually have two aspects of self-esteem. One's personal, one's communal. Personal is just how we feel about ourselves. Communal is how we feel about the place or people we come from. And the argument is that communal self-esteem is one of the big barriers for Indigenous students being successful students, because if they feel what they've been told through colonization, through residential schools, is that they should be ashamed of the people they come from. And if they feel that way about the people they come from, that lowers their expectations for themselves about what they can achieve in schooling. So this is something that really needs to be challenged in a lot of schools, is communal self-esteem. So there's a study you can use to do that. So we did this. We took these 8 photos of these different kids. 2 are Indigenous girls, 2 Indigenous boys, 2 are white girls, 2 are white boys. And we spent so long finding the photos that everybody could agree were like close enough, because you need to have like similar attractiveness. They need to be similarly happy, except for the kid to the second top from the right. He's like way happier than everyone else. And we put these 8 photos in front of students in the school. They'd never seen any of these kids before. They don't know any of them. We put them in front of students from 6 to 8 years old. Every student in the school, in this unreserved school where racism wasn't a problem because they had all First Nations teachers, we put them in front of all these students and we asked them a series of questions, all positive questions. We didn't ask any negative questions because we didn't want them to associate anything negative. And we asked them, which of these kids are smart? Which of these kids are good at many things? Which of these kids have lots of friends? Those types of questions. And they point to any of the kids that they feel like fit within that category. No other explanations were given, just those simple questions were asked to those kids. The findings were resounding. When we said, which of these kids are smart, they pointed to the white kids 81% of the time, the Indigenous kids 39% of the time. So by the time they were 6, 7, 8 years old, they had already internalized, these are the smart kids, these are the kids who are not smart. More than a 2-to-1 ratio, they found that. They assumed that about those kids. So I went back to the teachers and I showed them this data, and I've never seen research work more effectively. They're like, all right, let's do this decolonizing work, and we started the next day. So this really shows to me, no matter how positioned we think we are within this, no matter how much experience we have in these areas, all of us are required to do that decolonizing work. And that really showed that to that group. The really, obviously that's heartbreaking findings, but not surprising. The really frustrating thing, and not surprising as well, is by far the lowest who on every single one of those questions were those 2 Indigenous girls. And by so much, the lowest one is this girl right here. By far, I think in terms of acknowledging her being smart, it was something like 19% of the time. So it was drastically below everybody else. Every indicator, she was at the bottom. And we talked to something like 80 students or so. So it was a big enough sample. It wasn't just a really small sample size. So what we did based on that is we not only did the decolonizing work, but we did very intentional work with the students. So I went we judged it over 3 years, so we've done the same thing every year. And we saw some improvement for the way in which Indigenous girls or Indigenous femininity was expected. And we started developing intentional programming. And I said, this is the thing we found 2 years in a row. What are we going to do about it? What are some practical things we're going to do? So we developed a plan over the next year, which is unfolding right now, where we built upon some program that I found in Australia that teaches ways to value Indigenous femininity. And we did intentional things like inviting in speakers, Indigenous women who are successful, to come speak to them, have specific programs that challenge the ways in which we view Indigenous women. There's the 6 steps that we've done to specifically attend to this. So the main thing to take from this is regardless of how much background we think we have in this area, regardless of how we're positioned, decolonizing work is for everybody. We all need to do it, no matter how we think of our school. And this was an excellent example of the school full of First Nations teachers and First Nations students still having this internalized oppression, still having this huge need to do that decolonizing work on the front end. So I'm going to go through this really quickly, but if we understand that oppression plays out on an individual and systemic level, happens in the ways in which we interact with other people, but it also happens in the ways in which our systems are designed as well. So we need to think about, if we're challenging decolonial perspectives, or we're challenging colonization, we need to challenge that at an individual level, the ways we interact with one another, the assumptions we have, but also the ways in which our systems are designed as well. How is the system designed with a colonial perspective? in addition to the ways in which we're interacting with other people, how does that have a colonial mentality behind it as well? And there's like a long thing, we don't really have time to get into it today, but there's this way in which oppression plays out. It starts with stereotypes that we think aren't impactful. We internalize those stereotypes after hearing them over and over again, and then we see somebody who belongs to that group and we begin applying that assumption to that person. That's when it gets to the area of prejudice. We act based on that assumption. That's when it gets to the area of discrimination. And then if there's that power imbalance between those groups, that's when it's oppression. So to give you an example, if I get on the train and there's a stereotype that exists in society that people of color are dangerous or violent. This gets told to us through film, through TV, through conversations with people, through education. This is something that's socialized within us. We're constantly given this message that people of color are more violent or dangerous or criminals. I get on the train with this socialization or this stereotype that exists. I see somebody, a person of color on the train. I apply this thing that exists in the ether to that person. I think that person looks dangerous to me. Got no information that would make me think they're dangerous. It's the socialization that I don't realize is impacting my understanding of this person. I see that person and that's prejudice because I'm taking this stereotype and applying it to this individual I have no other information about. Discrimination is then, I go sit on a different side of the train because I don't want to be near this person who I think of as being dangerous. That's a discrimination, act of discrimination. It becomes oppression or racism in this case because there's a power imbalance between that person's social standing and my social standing within that society. So we can think of the same through sexism, ableism, classism, all those different things. There's individual ways in which oppression plays out. At the same time, there are systemic ways in which this plays out as well. So if we think of the ways in which our systems are designed to do these things, one example is within Baton Rouge right now, something's just been done to create structural inequity. And what happened was, in the city, there's sort of two halves of the city. One half is quite well off and more white. The other half is quite poor and typically more African Americans who live there. There was if you can watch a Frontline about this, it's called Separate Yet Unequal. There's a big group of people from the richer part of town that wanted to divide the city into two different towns. And one of the reasons, the main reason, is because the way in which education is typically funded in the US is through property taxes. And if you have a rich part of town that has high property taxes, your school gets a lot more money. And if you have a poor part of town with low property taxes, your school gets significantly less money. So they created two towns out of one town of saying, we don't want to spread out the wealth that we have here in education, we want to keep it within this small area. They created a structural inequity within that system of saying, all the rich people are only going to fund them, the poor people are going to keep people within that structure. Think of other things like redlining in the States. So in the US, they had a practice of redlining until the 1970s, where the government would not back loans for houses outside of certain areas in the city. So they would give banks these maps with red lines and say, these are the only places we're going to guarantee home loans for people of color. So they could not buy houses outside of those areas because the government would not back those loans. This is up until the 1970s this happened. Those areas were typically areas of high crime, low economic opportunity, poor educational systems, all these different things. And if you were not allowed to buy a house outside of this area, the chances of you prospering generation to generation are very low. And also, research shows that the way in which most people pass on wealth is through property. And if you're denied the access to buy property, you're denied the access to create generational wealth. So those are structural ways. There's things in the structure that are designed that are oppressive. And there's things in which we interact on an interpersonal level that are oppressive. If we think about decolonizing, how are we decolonizing both those interpersonal or those individual ones, but how are we also decolonizing some of the systems that exist within our school? Another example, I was working in doing some work in Nisga'a territory up in northern BC, and like a lot of schools, they have like a similar structure, a very regimented structure for like going out for recess and going out for lunch. And I was talking to people from the Nisga'a community, and they were saying, when somebody passes away in Nisga'a territory, the tradition is when the body's coming back, you're supposed to go inside as a sign of respect for that body. My community is only like a couple hundred kilometers away. We do something totally differently where we follow the body back from the funeral home to the long caravan follows people back. In Nisga'a territory, you're supposed to go inside to show respect. So within their school system, it's oppressive because it doesn't allow that opportunity for people to practice like that, showing respect to the body. So I went to the school and talked to them and was saying, hey, they told me that they would really appreciate it if the kids could go inside when the bodies were coming back because that's the way you show respect. So can you have like indoor recess during those periods? So the structures don't line up. And I was saying, can we shift this structure to be representative of this school that's all Nisga'a students, so why don't we align it? And they're like, no, we can't do that because the kids need to go outside. It's like, this is a real easy way for you to gain some currency and like develop a relationship, and you're just being so resistant. So it's like, we need to think of it on those two levels. What are the structural ways and what are the individual ways that's happening? So if you're thinking of doing decolonizing or indigenizing projects, are you doing a structural project or are you doing an individual project, and thinking about those as well? So other examples, farming laws. In residential schools, one of the justifications was we want Indigenous people to be good farmers, we want them to be good, we want them to be able to thrive within the Western economy. And what happened was, once Indigenous people, some did start being successful farmers, the government then changed the laws and they banned Indigenous people from on-reserve First Nations people from buying specific farming machinery and selling surplus crops. So we want you to be farmers, just don't own any machinery or sell your crops. Not sure exactly what kind of farmers they wanted them to be, but that's a structural design that's going to be oppressive. So again, difference between structure and individual acts of oppression. So we understand some of those decolonizing. Now let's get into some of the more, I think, fun and interesting aspects of indigenizing. So we're going to talk about translating this theory of indigenizing, of bringing in Indigenous knowledges into our system. We're going to talk about translating those theories into practice. So we're going to look at Smith's indigenizing projects. We're going to look at this PISA model that I developed with the school. We're going to think about the roles of teachers, and then finally look at witnessing, all in 17 or so minutes somehow. So these 25 decolonizing projects is based on Smith's work, and what these are is Smith identifies these 25 principles. I see them as being principles, as being sort of foundations of indigenizing work. She says decolonizing, but it's actually, from my perspective, indigenizing. So in her book, what she says is she names these 25 principles and gives short definitions for how Indigenous people see these principles. So things like reading, connecting, revitalizing, intervening, networking, protecting, negotiating. She gives like a one-paragraph definition of how either Maori or Indigenous folks define these terms, because they're different. All cultures don't see restoring the same way. The same way, like if I said family, and I asked you to write down what you think of when you think of family, we'd probably get 10 different definitions depending on our cultural, ethnic backgrounds, maybe a totally different idea of it. My partner, who's from Serbia, there's no word in Serbian for cousin. Anybody who's your cousin is like your brother and sister. So she sees no difference between her brother and her first cousins. They're exactly the same. So different cultures see those things. So all these terms are different depending on the culture you come from. So it's really important to do these to understand what these terms mean. And if you're interested in this, you can look up Decolonizing Methodologies PDF, find it online, and then there's a one-paragraph definition for each of these. So what I did was, when I read this, I was thinking, well, these same principles that we think of in research can actually translate seamlessly into teaching and pedagogy, or the ways in which we exist in our classroom. So I said, these same things, I'm going to try to identify how we're using them in teaching in order to justify their use, because a lot of these Indigenous pedagogies are sort of really new in the way they're applied in school systems. Not new within Indigenous communities, but new within the education system. And the way I think about it is, when we think about like decolonizing and indigenizing, in this case indigenizing, we need to think of like those 4 different areas in which we can indigenize. We can indigenize curriculum, which is sort of the way in which most people try to do it. We can indigenize pedagogy, which is far more rare. We can indigenize assessment, and then we can indigenize our basic classroom culture. But usually it's only that first level of curriculum is the area in which we begin engaging with indigenizing. But the challenge that I want to give is like, how can we get to those lower levels of pedagogy, those areas of assessment, and those areas of the culture in the classroom. And this is one way of doing it, a very accessible way of doing it. So in that paper I wrote, these are the reasons why this is important, and then here are the ways in which we're doing it. So I recruited 3 other colleagues of mine and got them to write about how if they can align any of these principles with their ways of teaching. So for me, I used negotiating. So an earlier version of our Indigenous course, we had a paper that was included. Then when I took it over, we moved away from that. But at that point, when we had a paper, I would use that idea of negotiating as both the assessment and sort of the pedagogy within my classroom. What I would do is I would allow my students to submit their paper a week before it was due, give them extensive formative feedback with no grade on it, and what we would do is we would negotiate their grade. But it was based on Smith's idea of negotiating, not on like a Western business form of negotiating. What Smith says is, For Indigenous communities, the process of negotiating is more important than the outcome. Adhering to the specific protocols during the process of your negotiation is far more important than actually what happens in the outcome. So I did a similar thing where the thing that I think is important in that negotiation with that student is not their grade, which is the outcome. I could care less about their grade. It does not matter to me at all. Typically within our faculty, it's probably going to be an A or an A minus, and that's going to make no difference in anyone's life if you get that. But the process, which is them reading and considering their feedback and coming and sitting and talking with me for half an hour, that could lead to them being a better teacher, lead to them understanding this knowledge in a way they might not have otherwise. So that process is more important than that outcome. So if we think of like an Indigenizing project, that's one of the ways in which I did it in my classroom. So if you're talking about your specific math class or STEM class, that's an Indigenizing process. And you can do that with regardless of whatever the content is. It doesn't really matter. So what I do for my students is, I think it's really fun. They get a little bit worried about it when we do it. But for 2 of the classes during the year, what I do is I tell the students, all right, write down for me a grade, a subject, and a topic on a Post-it note. So they'll write like grade 10 biology, Krebs cycle, or like grade 12 history, French Revolution. And there'll be a bag full of those Post-its with those in there. The other bag, I cut up these principles and put them in the other one. And what I tell them is, as a group, they come pick 1 out of the bag of subject, topic, and then 2 out of the bag of this. And I say, you're using these as the pedagogies in order to teach this topic. So they're getting like intervening and gendering, and they have to teach about Shakespeare using those different, and these are the pedagogies. I have to explain them over and over again. You're not teaching these as topics. This is the process you're using to teach this other one. And usually they sit down and start freaking out because they're like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to use gendering and restoring to teach physics? And they start getting really nervous. And I tell them, just read the definition a bunch of times, and I'm going to come around and tell you understand what it is. Throughout the 2 days, they go through the same cycle, and by the end, they come up with these really transformational ways of teaching these subjects that they never would have considered otherwise. And for me, this is the moment for them when they really take this work on, because it's until I show them this will actually be beneficial to them that they're actually going to start using it. And they start seeing like, wow, I never thought of using democratizing and naming as a process to teach us, and it expands their toolkit on their pedagogy that they have. And it's a really, really great opportunity for them. And I think and that's a really hard way they have to do it, because they have to take a topic they may be totally unfamiliar with, and they're teaching it using 2 of these principles. And I say, well, once you're in the school system and say you're a math teacher, well, you're really comfortable with the topic already, the content you're very comfortable with. Now just use 1 of these principles and try to use that. Doesn't have to be every time. Definitely doesn't have to be every time. Maybe once a week, you're selecting 1 of these principles and you're saying, one of my lesson plans, I'm going to use this as the process or the pedagogy in order to teach the content I'm already using. And you can find this online, these 25 principles. I wrote a paper about it. You can check that out if you want. But to me, this is the most accessible way to do meaningful Indigenizing work in your classroom. It's challenging the process rather than the content. You're getting to those areas of pedagogy and you're getting those areas of assessment rather than staying in those areas only of content. So this is a project I did with a community, and what we wanted to do was, the work that I was doing was embedding their own ways of knowing into the pedagogy of the school. So what I did was, working with them, we developed 5 of these principles that were meaningful to them as a Cree community. And what I said I was going to do is, I was going to, similar to what you do with Smith, we were going to turn these into the processes they were using to teach. Rather than, we weren't teaching about them, we're using them as the processes. But before we could do that, they had to understand what these actually meant. So my goal was, in the first month of the school year, I wanted every single student, I could stop any student or any teacher and say, tell me what Sakituin is. And they would explain to me what it meant. They'd not only know what it is, but see it in action. So what we did at the beginning of the year, put posters in all the classes. Teacher goes up at the end of the day, there's an announcement 15 minutes before the end of the day, and they'll say, it's time to do your PISM work. And the teacher will come up in front of this board and say, Pamatsuin, celebrating life with a positive attitude. This is the time when I lived Pamatsuin today, and the teacher would share an experience of when they lived that principle. Go through all 5 of them. That next day, or for the whole week, the teacher does that every day at the end of the day, reading out what those principles mean, and then telling the students, this is when I enacted this principle on this day. And another thing it was doing, it was saying, these are the principles we're going to be living by in this class. So if I don't live up to them, you can hold me accountable using these principles. And if you don't live up to them, I'm going to hold you accountable living these as well. Is that really Manachituin? Are you showing respect for all creation by doing that? So the second week, what they would do, the teacher would come up in front of the class again, read it out, Amihawan, understanding and practicing the true meaning of prayer. And then the teacher would read that out and then say, this is the time I saw this student living this principle of Amihawan today. Because we want those students to feel like they're already doing that, they're already successful and engaged in their cultural ways of knowing. Do that for a full week. Third week comes up, the teacher comes up in front of the class again, end of every day. Manachituin, respect for all creation. All right, tell me a time when one of your classmates has lived this principle. So we know those students are able to recognize it. And then the fourth week, what we did is we expanded that into 5 weeks. And what we did is each week we picked one of the principles. And they went really deep into having discussions about it, what it means, why it's important, how they live it. And then they would create awards for each different principle. So there'd be a Pamatsan award, there'd be an Amihawan award. And they would get the students to design it, they would get them to make it. And then on each Thursday of the week, they would have their students take that award home and give it to somebody in their family. So they would take like the award for Sakituin, and they would say to their aunt, I'm giving this award for Sakituin. Sakituin means love and caring for self and others. I'm giving it to you because you did this. And then what we asked the students to do is remember how it felt to give that person that award and then how they reacted. And then the next day the students would come back and they would each get time to get up in front of the class and share, I gave my award to my aunt for this. This is how it felt to give it to her, and this is how she reacted when I gave it to her. And we were acknowledging, we were telling the kids, like, you are now the knowledge keepers in this territory of these ways of being, because you're the one who's educating some of your family about this who might not know about it. And then I was in some of those classes when they came back the next day, and they were like, I gave it to my mom, and she was crying when I gave it to her, and it felt really good for these different reasons. So then we started off with those, but then what we went on from doing from there was we began with every lesson plan, we had on the top of it, what's your process goal and what's your content goal? And within your process goal, you had to have one of those principles had to be part of the process in your lesson plan, at least twice a day is what we had. In addition, what we did is we planned a yearly event that went along with it. So one year they did the round dance, this year they're doing hand games. So the problem was in the past is they would just bring the kids to these cultural practices and they wouldn't explain to them everything that was involved with it. They wouldn't explain the value or the underlying principles of it. So what we do is we build up throughout the year to them learning about it, using these as the foundations. Well, how do we recognize Sakituin within the round dance? What aspects of hand games include Manachituin? So we're building up from these principles. So we're using Indigenous knowledges as not only the foundation of the teaching, but also the aspects of content as well. So we're trying to be as pervasive in all these different elements. The next step we do is how do we get that into assessment? How are we using these principles of Amihawan, Pamatsuin within our assessment approaches? Jump over that one really quick. This is another thing that I use with the community in Northern Alberta, where we were doing work with them on parental engagement. And we were very intentional about dividing our understanding of parental involvement with parental engagement. So parental involvement is when parents or guardians, family members, community have a relationship with either the people or the educational space. That's parental involvement. Parental engagement is when parents, community members have relationships with the learning that's happening in the school. So what we were trying to achieve is both those levels. We wanted parental involvement, but we wanted parental engagement as well. And the school we were working with, the situation could not have been worse in terms of parental engagement and involvement when we went there. Those two sides were like not speaking to each other, a lot of animosity towards one another. It was like a really challenging environment to work in. And what they wanted to do was, how can we challenge our ways of thinking about this? So we interviewed as many parents as we could talk to, all the teachers, administration, leaders in the community, and we asked them these questions of like, what would be a healthy form of communication? How can we improve this? What's not working? And what we developed was this framework. Looks complex because we have it in 3 languages, Cree, Dene, and English. But what we came up with is we thought there was 4 domains within their approach, within the Cree and Dene approaches in that community. There was 4 different domains in which you could practice parental engagement. First one is the classroom. So what are we doing in the classroom to create engagement with the parents and community members? Second level is the school. What are we doing at the school level to create that level of engagement? The third is, how are we doing it on a community level? So how are we having events outside of the school or finding places outside of the school to develop? And the fourth was, how are we using traditional or cultural events in order to create parental engagement. And the things we heard from the parents and the teachers were these different principles that we wanted to be foundational to any work we're doing. So we have things like gratitude, respect, love, learning, all those sorts of things are things we heard consistently. So what we developed was, well, these are pretty transferable. It's very rare you'll go to a school where like we don't want respect in this relationship. Those things are pretty consistent. But what we did was we developed plans for each of those domains based on those principles. And then what I've done since then is brought this, there's like a full day PD that we've done where we support different schools in considering their approach to parental engagement with on-reserve communities. And what we've done is, get people to go in the areas in which they're the most interested in, whether it be classroom level, school level, cultural level. And then we've got them to use those principles to design a direct approach that can begin challenging this. So with one of the on-reserve schools I went to, they developed a plan within the community level and I made them commit to one, and I made one person take responsibility for that. On the community level, what they did was they made a commitment to creating a billboard that announced, that had a calendar on it for each month, and they would show the events that were happening that month so that the community members knew they were welcome to those events. And then in addition, what happened was they created a program where each month a different couple of students go in front of the board and they take a video of them explaining what's happening that month and inviting everybody, and created a YouTube page that the parents can go to. So for each of those levels, domains, they created a plan based on those principles that can attend to that. So again, that's like a really foundational, for me, Indigenous approach. The last one I'll share is something that I'm very proud of that we've done at the University of Calgary. So it's changing our approach to pedagogy and assessment to really be founded on Indigenous knowledges. So prior to me taking over the course, it was primarily only in the area of content that we were indigenizing. So if we think of, we were shifting away from only Western forms of knowledge that we were discussing to using Indigenous knowledges in a course. So the mandatory Indigenous course was primarily content. In terms of pedagogy and assessment, we were still aligning with the way the university typically did things. We were having papers at the end of the year. We did the same sort of lecture format that you would for any other class. So we did it only in the area of content, none of those other areas. And when I took over leading our course, I said, we're not going to do that anymore because we're being really hypocritical, where we're telling our students, like, you need to decolonize and indigenize in your classroom, now write this paper and tell us how you're going to do it. So we're not doing what we're asking of them to do in the first place. So we're modeling, while we're stating we want decolonizing and indigenizing, we're modeling the exact opposite. So I got together with some of my colleagues and we started developing a plan on how we can begin doing this. Spent days and days trying to figure out what we could do, how we could challenge it, what are meaningful ways we could do it that would be replicable, that can be taken up by multiple different professors. And one of the things I started thinking about was one of the conversations I had with one of my cousins, who's one of the leaders in our clan system. She's one of the, has names who lead the Frog Clan. And she was saying, like, for Dacath people, being a witness is such a fundamental aspect of who we are. Being a witness is really important for a bunch of reasons. One is we're an oral tradition. So in order for you to lead that system, that really complex potlatch system, you need to go there and witness it over and over and over again so you know how it works. In addition, like, being a witness brings power to something, like not in a metaphysical way, but in a really practical way. By us being there and attending, it's saying this is something important and I'm giving power to this happening. Similar to, like, if you went to a wedding or you went to a graduation, if nobody turned up, people are going to really question, like, is this really valuable? Do people see this as being important? So being a witness is really important on these multiple levels. So what we did in our program is we thought, what are we trying to achieve in this program? Well, one, we want students to understand the history. Second, we want them to position themselves and understand they have a role within this. Third, we want them to be engaged to actually do it. And then fourth, they need the skills to actually begin doing the work. And we said, like, what about writing a paper is putting them in that position? Nothing really. We're evaluating something we already know they know how to do. Everybody who got into our program has like a 3.7 GPA, so they already proved a long time ago they can write a paper. So we're just reevaluating something we already knew the answer to. But instead, if we're trying to get to those 4 areas, how can we create a pedagogy or an assessment that's going to lead us to beginning to evaluate if they're doing that? So what we did is we used this principle of witnessing. Through that principle of witnessing, what we did was each week, you have a group of 5 students who are together for the whole year. At the end of every week, they meet as a group and they have a discussion about this course, Indigenous knowledges, how they feel they're prepared to do this work, if they still feel there's some barriers to their learning, all these conversations. One person each week plays the role of the witness. They don't speak at all, They just go there and witness their colleagues talking. And at the end of that conversation, they go away and record a 3-minute video of what they saw. This is the general spirit of what was discussed here, and they record that. The next week, there's a new witness in their group, the other 4 talk, they record their message, keeps on going till the end of the year. At the end of the year, their group goes and they watch all their clips from the beginning till the end, and they see where they started and where they ended up. And then what they have to do is come in front of the class and make a claim to the rest of the class. This is the claim we're making to this work. This is where we started, and this is where we ended up, and this is how we're going to take up this work in a meaningful way. In addition to that claim, they also have to create an artifact, which is something that can support them when they're in the field later. Sometimes it's a lesson plan, a unit plan. Other times, some groups have created like a manifesto. Something that's going to support you to actually do this work. So in addition to that, what we do each week is we bring up a new Indigenous group's definition of what it means to be a witness. Because just like that Smith work, we can't rely on Western definitions of witnessing because it means something different. Just like we said, we might have a different definition of what family means. Different Indigenous groups have a different definition of what it means to be a witness. Someone want to read this Coast Salish definition out for us really quickly?
I'll go.
Excellent.
Being called to witness by the Coast Salish and Interior Salish peoples of Canada is an honor, a tradition dating back long before contact with European cultures. Salish people's history is an oral history. The role of a witness is to record the message of the event in their hearts and minds, and afterward remember and validate the special occasion by carrying the message and sharing it with friends, neighbors, and community members.
Thank you. So this is typically the first one we use. So before every witnessing session, we bring a new definition from a different Indigenous group of what it means to be a witness. Then what we do is we begin having a discussion of what does this mean? Again, the same as if we brought an elder into class. We can't just leave that knowledge there and expect they're going to translate it. We need to be very intentional. So I say, like, what does this mean to you? And we'll have a long discussion. And then the question I ask is, how are we going to actually use this today? How are we going to go beyond understanding this, but use this in our witnessing? So for this one, I think it's really straightforward, where it says, the role of a witness is to record the message of the event in their hearts and minds, and afterwards, remember and validate the special occasion by carrying the message and sharing it with friends, neighbors, and community members. So what we do in that class is everybody in our class makes a commitment. They're going to go talk to one person about what happened in their witnessing group outside of the classroom. Talk to one family member, one friend, and they're going to share that message because they're supposed to record it in their hearts and minds and do it. So we're getting them to actually enact these principles of being a witness. It's really fundamentally indigenizing work. We're really asking them to use these principles as the way in which we're going to learn. So in addition, during our course, we have 1 week on residential schools. And during that week, we watch We Were Children. So anybody who's seen that, it's devastating. It's like reenactments while the people are sharing their stories about what happened to them, and it's really devastating. Our students are just like torn apart by that. It's really upsetting to watch. Our witnessing at the end of that week is the most powerful witnessing because people like get really upset, share like a lot of like really vulnerable things about themselves. So for that week, I wanted to be really intentional about our witnessing to think about this. So what I did is I used this Métis definition of witnessing that I was able to find. And what it says is, those who sit in the role of the witness must be aware that safety is something that is renegotiated in each interaction. It can never be taken for granted. Given that the teller sits in a position of vulnerability, how then do learners or listeners offer something back in a way that metaphorically wraps the teller in a blanket of care, acknowledgement, and love? As Mr. King says, what will we do now that we have heard this story? So this idea of witnessing goes beyond, it's different than what the Coast Salish would say. This Métis perspective is saying we have a responsibility as witnesses, as people who are witnessing that. We have a responsibility to provide care and love to people who are sharing something vulnerable. So we talk about this, and I ask the students, how are we going to do this today? Because your classmates are going to need it. So what are some ways in which we're going to wrap our colleagues around with that blanket of care when they're sharing these really vulnerable things. And they'll come up with direct ways in which they're going to enact it on that day. And then the next day when we come back, I'll say, tell me about witnessing. How did you enact that principle, Métis principle of witnessing? How did you use that in the ways in which you were listening, the ways in which you were interacting with one another? So to me, this is the most impactful way in which we've indigenized our course at the university, is by using this as the pedagogy. Now we're taking the next step and we're using it in the assessment model. So we're in the middle of designing it right now. What we're doing is, if we're thinking of those outcomes again, how are we getting to those places of understanding the history, seeing ourselves positioned within it, being motivated to do it, and then knowing how to do it? So what we're doing now is we're going to give all of our students like pieces of paper or some online thing they can get onto that has those 4 different areas, and they're going to watch their classmates present at the end, make their claim to the rest of the class, and they're going to give them qualitative feedback in each of those 4 areas. That's the only assessment we're giving them. We're not giving them any grade. If you do it and you take it on in a meaningful way, you're going to get an A. But your colleagues are going to give you major qualitative feedback in all 4 of those areas are, do you understand the history? Have you positioned yourself within this work? Are you motivated to do it? And do you have the actual plan or process to take it up? They're going to give you qualitative feedback, and that's the only thing they're going to get. I'm going to give them feedback in those areas as well, but it's going to fit within the rest of it. So we're, again, moving beyond those steps of just content, then we move to pedagogy, now we're moving to the areas of assessment as well. How are we continuing to challenge those? So witnessing is just one approach, like I shared with you, the approach that we're using, but there's so many Indigenous knowledges that you can use from the territories around here. I think being in this area is extremely fortunate because there's so much scholarship and so much knowledge that's available to you of the peoples in these areas. If you go like to my territory, this witnessing work, actually I'm building it out to develop a research methodology based on it. So instead of viewing yourself as a researcher, it's viewing yourself as a witness. And how does that change the ways in which you would approach research if you're a witness instead of a researcher? But going into my territory, I do some work with UNBC, and they use a lot of like the Plains knowledge in order to represent within the university, like the ways of being, the ways in which research is being done, because that stuff isn't established in that area in an academic sphere yet. So I would say this place, more than most other Indigenous places, areas of Indigenous people, you have access to so much knowledge here. And it's thinking, that thing similar to witnessing, how are you translating some of those similar things into the practices in your classroom? And I just think it's such a wonderful opportunity. And I just think it's, the way in which we conceptualize this work, I think is really important. And it's moving away from seeing it as something that's being imposed upon us or something that's something that's hard for us to do, rather than seeing it as something as a massive opportunity. It's providing additional ways in which we can think about teaching, providing us different ways in which we can think about leading, different ways in which we can think about approaching that. So that's even though it's 2.5 hours, it seems like a very short version of it. Are there any like burning questions that people have, since we've already gone over time? Anything that you're like unsure about or you'd like really like to know more about, or any resources I can connect you with? Now's the time for asking those questions. Anything coming up for people? So I did it all today, it sounds like. Excellent. Wonderful. So if you have anything else you want to talk about, feel free to send me an email. I'd be more than happy to follow up. And thanks so much for coming today and participating.